When the war ended, when the ring went into the fire and the dark tower fell and the shadow lifted from the world, the great heroes of the Fellowship went their separate ways. Frodo sailed west, wounded beyond the healing of Middle-earth. Sam went home to the Shire, to his garden and his family, and the quiet life he had earned. Aragorn took his throne and ruled for 120 years, the greatest king the world had seen since the Elder Days. And the hobbits Merry and Pippin lived out their long and honoured lives, eventually riding south to Gondor one last time. But there are two members of the Fellowship whose after-story almost nobody talks about. Two companions whose post-war lives are among the strangest, most beautiful, and most quietly revolutionary tales in all of Tolkien. Not because they fought great battles or toppled dark lords after the war, but because what they did together in the long years of peace that followed was something that had never happened before in the entire history of Middle-earth. Something that broke one of the oldest rules in the world and rewrote the relationship between two peoples who had been estranged since before the sun first rose. Their names are Legolas, son of Thranduil, prince of the woodland realm and elf, and Gimli, son of Glyn of the line of Durin, a dwarf. And their story after the ring was destroyed is a love story, not a romance, but something rarer and in some ways more powerful. A friendship so genuine, so steadfast, so willing to cross every boundary that history and culture had placed between them, that it carried a dwarf all the way to the Undying Lands, the one place in all of creation where no dwarf had ever been or was ever meant to go. Tonight, I want to tell you that story, the story of what Legolas and Gimli did after the war, where they went, what they built, and how they ended. Because their ending is one of the most astonishing and most overlooked moments in all of Tolkien's legendarium, and it tells us something about the nature of friendship and grace that the great battles and the epic quests, for all their glory, never quite managed to say. Stay with me. This one is gentle, and it is beautiful, and it goes to a place you might not expect. Part 1. The most unlikely friendship in Middle-earth. Before we can understand what happened after the war, we have to understand what happened during it, because the friendship between Legolas and Gimli did not arrive fully formed. It was forged, slowly and painfully, across the long road of the Fellowship, against centuries of mutual suspicion and distrust, and the forging itself is one of the great quiet accomplishments of the whole tale. Elves and dwarves did not get along. This is not a minor point of cultural friction. It was a rift that reached back thousands of years, to the very foundations of Middle-earth, rooted in ancient betrayals and competing claims, and the fundamental difference in how the two peoples related to the world. The elves loved the growing things, the forests, the stars, the living beauty of the surface world. The dwarves loved the deep things, the stone, the metal, the hidden veins of the earth, the beauty that lay buried in the bones of the world. And each people across the long ages had come to see the other's love as a kind of blindness, an inability to appreciate what really mattered, a failure of vision that bordered on insult. The specific grudge between Legolas's people and Gimli's was even sharper. Legolas was a prince of the woodland realm, the kingdom of Thranduil in northern Mirkwood. Gimli was the son of Glyn, one of the 13 dwarves who had journeyed with Bilbo to the Lonely Mountain. And Thranduil, Legolas's father, had imprisoned those dwarves in his dungeons during that very quest, holding them captive in the Elven King's halls until they escaped in barrels down the river. Gimli's own father had been locked in Thranduil's cells. The personal grudge was as sharp as the cultural one. So when the Fellowship was formed at the Council of Elrond, when Legolas and Gimli found themselves on the same side, pledged to the same quest, walking the same road, the tension between them was immediate and real. They bristled at each other. They exchanged sharp words. When the company debated which road to take through the mountains, the friction between the elf and the dwarf was palpable. Each one suspicious of the other's motives, each one carrying the weight of a cultural enmity that was older than most civilizations. And then, step by step, league by league, danger by danger, something changed. Not all at once. Not through a grand gesture of reconciliation, through the slow, patient, almost invisible work of shared experience. The experience of fighting side by side, of depending on each other, of seeing the other's courage and loyalty and worth under conditions that stripped away all pretense and left only the raw truth of who a person actually was. The elf and the dwarf, forced together by the quest, discovered to their mutual surprise and perhaps initial discomfort that the being they had been taught to distrust was, in fact, admirable, worthy, someone they could respect, and then like, and then, eventually, love, Part 2. The moment in Lothlorien. The turning point, the moment when the grudging tolerance became something real and lasting, came in the most unlikely of places, Lothlorien, the Golden Wood, the heart of elvish culture. The last place on earth where you would expect a dwarf to fall in love. But fall in love Gimli did, not with an elf in the romantic sense, but with the Lady of the Golden Wood herself, Galadriel, the most beautiful and most ancient of all the elves still dwelling in Middle-earth. And this is one of the strangest and most tender moments in the whole story, because Gimli, gruff, blunt, suspicious of all things elvish, a dwarf who had walked into Lothlorien with his hand on his axe and his guard at its highest, looked upon Galadriel and was completely, helplessly, irrevocably enchanted. Not enchanted by magic, enchanted by beauty. The kind of beauty that speaks to something beyond culture and beyond prejudice. The kind that reaches past every wall you have built and touches the thing underneath. Gimli looked at Galadriel and he saw, perhaps for the first time, what the elves saw in the world. The luminous, timeless, heartbreaking beauty that the elves spent their whole existence trying to preserve and that most dwarves had never been close enough to see. And it broke something open in him. The wall between elf and dwarf, which had been built over thousands of years of distrust and reinforced by Gimli's own experience and upbringing, cracked in the presence of Galadriel's beauty, and through the crack poured something new, a capacity for wonder, for reverence, for love that crossed the ancient boundary. And Galadriel, who had seen the ages of the world turn, and who understood the deep currents of the heart better than almost anyone, responded to Gimli's devotion with a gift that carries more meaning than it seems. When the fellowship departed Lothlorien, Galadriel asked each of them what they would wish for as a parting gift. And Gimli, bold, honest, trembling Gimli, asked for a single strand of her hair. The significance of this request is enormous, and most readers miss it entirely. In the deep past, in the elder days, the greatest of all the elven smiths, Fëanor, the mightiest maker among all the children of Ilúvatar, the craftsman who created the Silmarils, had asked Galadriel for a strand of her hair. 3 times he asked, and 3 times she refused him. Fëanor, the greatest elf who ever lived, was denied. And Gimli, a dwarf, a son of a people that elves had distrusted since the beginning of the world, asked for the same gift. And Galadriel gave him not 1 strand, but 3. 3 golden hairs, freely given to a dwarf, a gift that the greatest of the elves had been refused. Do you understand what that means? In the economy of Tolkien's world, where gifts carry the weight of history, and where the deep past reverberates through every present moment, Galadriel's gift to Gimli was an act of extraordinary grace. A declaration that this dwarf, this gruff and blunt and unexpected being, had seen something in her that Fëanor, for all his brilliance, had not. Gimli treasured those 3 hairs for the rest of his life. He set them in a crystal and wore them as a token of devotion, and he spoke of Galadriel with a reverence that startled everyone who heard it, because no dwarf had ever spoken of an elf that way, and the tenderness in Gimli's voice when he mentioned the Lady of the Golden Wood was something no one had prepared for. It was the most undwarvish thing anyone had ever seen. And it was also, perhaps, the most truly dwarvish thing, because dwarves, underneath the gruffness and the suspicion, have hearts as deep as the mines they delve, and Gimli's heart, once opened by Galadriel's beauty, never closed again. And this is where the friendship with Legolas deepened into something unbreakable, because Legolas was an elf. He understood what Gimli was feeling, perhaps better than Gimli himself. He saw a dwarf falling in love with elvish beauty, and instead of condescension or amusement, Legolas felt respect, kinship. The recognition that this dwarf, this son of a people his own father had imprisoned, was capable of seeing and loving the thing that Legolas himself loved most in the world, the beauty that the elves had spent ages preserving, the beauty that most of the world walked past without seeing. Gimli saw it, and loved it, and was changed by it. And that, for Legolas, was the moment the friendship became real. Not tolerance, not the grudging respect of warriors who have fought side by side. Something deeper, the bond of 2 beings who love the same thing, even if they came to that love by different roads. Part 3. The competitive grace. Before we move into the post-war years, we should appreciate one more thing about how the friendship worked during the war itself, because it has a quality that is unique in all of Tolkien and that tells us something important about the nature of their bond. It is the quality of competitive grace, the way Legolas and Gimli turned their rivalry into a form of affection, their disagreement into a kind of play, their cultural friction into a game that deepened their bond rather than straining it. The orc counting contest at Helm's Deep is the most famous example. In the middle of one of the most desperate battles of the war, with Saruman's Uruk-hai pouring over the walls of the Hornburg in their thousands, Legolas and Gimli kept a running count of the enemies each one killed, competing, boasting, taunting each other, keeping score as though the battle were a sporting event. It is one of the most beloved moments in the whole story, and it is often read as comic relief, a light-hearted counterpoint to the grimness of the siege. And it is that. But it is also something more. The contest is a form of intimacy. It is the elf and the dwarf saying to each other, in the only language their pride will allow, "I see you. I respect you. I am paying attention to you. I care enough about your skill and your courage to measure myself against it." The competition is not hostility. It is the disguise that affection wears when the people feeling it are too proud and too gruff and too culturally conditioned to express it directly. Legolas and Gimli cannot, at this point in the story, look at each other and say, "I love you" as a friend. That is not how elves and dwarves talk to each other. But they can count orcs together and boast and needle each other, and in the counting and the boasting and the needling, the love is there, real and strong and growing, wearing the armor of rivalry because neither of them has any other armor that fits. And the competition evolved, across the war, into something gentler. By the time they reached the paths of the dead and Legolas was frightened, yes, the elf was frightened. In one of the few moments where Legolas shows genuine fear, it was Gimli who steadied him. Gimli the dwarf whose element was stone and the deep places, and who felt, in the haunted dark beneath the mountains, more at home than the elf who belonged to the forests and the starlight. They traded roles. They supported each other. The strength of each became the shelter of the other, and the ancient enmity between their peoples was, in their friendship, slowly and completely overwritten by something newer and truer. By the end of the war, they were inseparable. Not just allies, not just fellow soldiers, not just members of the same fellowship, friends, in the fullest and most binding sense. And the friendship they had built, forged in fire and tested across every kind of danger and hardship, would carry them through the long years of peace that followed and would lead them, at the very end, to a destination that no one in the history of the world could have predicted. Part 3.5. The Crucibles. Let us trace, briefly, the specific moments of the war that forged the bond, because the friendship was not built in a single moment, but across many, each one adding another layer of shared experience to the foundation, each one proving to the other that this relationship was real and would hold. Moria was the first great test. When the Fellowship descended into the mines, the great dwarf kingdom of Khazad-diem, fallen and overrun, its halls haunted by orcs and worse things, the dynamics of the friendship shifted. Gimli entered the mines with hope, expecting to find his kinsman living and thriving in the deep. And what he found instead was death, the tomb of Balin, the bodies of the dwarves who had tried to recolonize the mines, the full horror of a kingdom that had become a grave. Gimli's grief was terrible, and it was Legolas the elf, the being who should have been the last to comfort a dwarf, who was beside him through it, who shared the darkness of the mines with him, who fought alongside him through the orc assault and the flight from the Balrog. In Moria, the friendship was tested by grief, and it held. And holding through grief created a bond that lighter experiences could never have created. The Hornburg was the second great test. Helm's Deep, where the orc counting began, where the two of them stood on the walls together through the night, fighting side by side against an enemy that seemed unstoppable. There is a particular quality to the bond between people who have stood beside each other in a fight that might kill them both. A quality of trust that goes beyond words, beyond culture, beyond every rational calculation of who you are supposed to trust and who you are not. Legolas and Gimli stood on the Deeping Wall together, and the orcs came at them, and each of them trusted the other with his life. After Helm's Deep, the friendship was no longer a pleasant surprise. It was a fact, tested and proven, that neither of them would ever question again. And the Paths of the Dead were the third test, perhaps the strangest one, because in the haunted dark under the mountains, the roles reversed. Legolas, the elf, was afraid. The dead who walked those paths were a terror that touched the spiritual realm where elves were more present than other beings, and Legolas felt their dread more keenly than anyone in the company. And Gimli, the dwarf, whose element was the underground, who felt more at home in the dark passages under stone than the elf who belonged to the forests and the sky, Gimli was the steadier of the two. He was afraid, certainly. No sane being would walk the paths of the dead without fear, but his fear was a different kind, less soul-deep, less existentially threatening. And so, in the darkness, the dwarf steadied the elf, as the elf had steadied the dwarf in Moria, and another layer of trust was added to the foundation. Moria, Helm's Deep, the Paths of the Dead, grief, battle, fear, 3 tests, each one demanding a different kind of trust, each one proving the friendship in a different register. By the time the war ended, the bond between Legolas and Gimli had been tested in every way a bond can be tested, by grief, by danger, by fear, by the long, slow grind of shared hardship, and it had held through all of them. The friendship that had started as a grudging tolerance between an elf and a dwarf had become, through the crucibles of the war, one of the strongest bonds in Middle-earth. And when the peace came, and the building began, that bond was the foundation on which everything else was built. Part 4. Legolas and the Sea Longing. After the war, something happened to Legolas that would shape the rest of his life. Something that was, in a sense, a wound, a calling, and a doom all wrapped into a single experience. And it began not with the ending of the war, but during the war, on the banks of the river at Pelagia, when Legolas heard the cry of the gulls. The gulls, the white seabirds, wheeling and calling over the coastal waters of Gondor as the army of the dead swept the Corsair fleet. And when Legolas heard their cries, something woke in him that had been sleeping, or that had never been called into being until that moment. The sea longing, the great and terrible yearning that comes upon the elves of Middle-earth when they hear or see the sea. The longing to sail west, to leave the mortal world behind, to cross the sundering waters and reach the undying lands beyond. This is not a minor thing in Tolkien's world. The sea longing is one of the great sorrows of the elves, a calling so powerful that once awakened, it never fully subsides. It is the pull of the elves' true home, the blessed realm of Valinor, the land where the Valar dwell and where the elves were first meant to live in the light of the two trees. Every elf who lingers in Middle-earth feels at some point the pull of the west, the longing to go home to the land of deathless beauty. And once the sea longing is awakened by the sight or the sound of the sea, it becomes a constant presence, a yearning that underlies everything. A hunger that no beauty of Middle-earth can fully satisfy. Galadriel had warned Legolas of this. In Lothlorien, she had spoken to each member of the Fellowship, giving them words of counsel and foresight. And to Legolas she had said, "Legolas Greenleaf long under tree, in joy thou hast lived. Beware of the sea. If thou hearest the cry of the gull on the shore, thy heart shall then rest in the forest no more." It was a warning and a prophecy, and it came true at Pelagia, when the gull cries pierced something in Legolas's elvish heart, and the longing woke, and nothing was ever quite the same again. So when the war ended, Legolas was carrying two things: the joy of victory and the grief of the sea longing. The war was won. The shadow was lifted. The world was free. But Legolas could no longer rest in the forests of his father's kingdom with the same easy contentment he had known before. The sea was calling. The west was pulling. And sooner or later he would have to answer. But not yet. Not for a long time. Because Legolas had made a promise to his friend, a commitment to the years of building and renewal that lay ahead, a determination to see the new age through before he answered the call that would take him away from Middle-earth forever. And the friend he had promised was Gimli. Part 5. Gimli and the Glittering Caves. While the sea longing was stirring in Legolas, something entirely different was stirring in Gimli. Something that was, in its own way, just as powerful and just as transformative. Because during the war, at the Battle of Helm's Deep, Gimli had seen something that had captured his dwarvish heart as completely as Galadriel's beauty had captured it in Lothlorien. He had seen the glittering caves of Aglarond. Behind the fortress of the Hornburg, behind the defensive walls of Helm's Deep, there lay a system of caves that Gimli discovered during the battle. Caves of unearthly beauty, filled with crystal formations and mineral deposits that caught the light and fractured it into 1,000 colours, a natural wonder that no dwarf had ever properly explored or appreciated. And Gimli, looking upon those caves with the eyes of a maker, with the eyes of a dwarf who understood stone the way Legolas understood trees, was overwhelmed. He spoke of the caves to Legolas afterward, and his description is one of the most beautiful passages in all of Tolkien. A dwarf trying to express, in words, the beauty he has seen in the deep places of the earth, struggling to convey to an elf what stone and crystal and the hidden architecture of the underground can mean to a being who was made to love such things. Gimli did not want to mine the caves, not to exploit them, not to tear the beauty out of them for profit. He wanted to tend them, to explore them carefully, to reveal their beauty without destroying it, to be a steward of the underground the way the elves were stewards of the forests. He wanted, in essence, to do for the caves what the elves did for Lothlorien, to preserve and reveal beauty, to work with the materials of the world rather than against them, to be a guardian of the wonder he had found. And Legolas, listening to Gimli describe the caves, understood something that most elves never understood about dwarves. The elves had always seen the dwarves as miners, diggers, exploiters of the earth, beings who tore into the stone for gold and gems and cared nothing for the beauty they destroyed. But Gimli's love for the glittering caves was not the love of a miner. It was the love of an artist, a custodian, a being who saw beauty in stone the way Legolas saw beauty in leaves. And Legolas recognized in Gimli's devotion to the caves the same quality of reverent love that he himself felt for the forests and the stars. They were the same, he and Gimli. They loved different things, but they loved them in the same way, and that recognition, born from the caves, was another thread in the bond that was weaving them ever more tightly together. After the war, Gimli returned to the glittering caves and made good on his vision. He became the Lord of the Glittering Caves, leading a colony of dwarves from Erebor to Aglarond, establishing a dwarf realm in the caverns behind Helm's Deep, and overseeing the careful, reverent exploration and beautification of the caves. Under Gimli's stewardship, the Glittering Caves became one of the wonders of the New Age, a place where dwarvish craft served dwarvish love of beauty, where the stone was not torn apart but revealed, where the deep earth was tended with the same care that the best elves gave to the green world above. Part 6. The Builders of the New Age. And then Legolas and Gimli did something together that is to me one of the most moving things in the whole story. Something that represents, in a single act, everything their friendship meant and everything it could accomplish. They rebuilt Minas Tirith. After the War of the Ring, the White City of Gondor was damaged, its walls scarred, its gate broken by the battering ram Grond, its streets marked by the siege and the fire and the long, desperate defense. Minas Tirith had held, but it bore the scars of holding, and the city needed restoration, not just repair, but renewal. A rebirth befitting the dawn of a new age and the return of the king. And it was Legolas and Gimli who led that renewal. Gimli brought dwarves from the Lonely Mountain, from Erebor, the great dwarf kingdom of the north. And these dwarves, master craftsmen, the finest stoneworkers in all of Middle-earth, rebuilt the walls and the gates of Minas Tirith. The great gate of the city, which had been broken by Grond, was remade in mithril and steel, a gate forged by dwarves, a wonder of craft and strength, replacing the ruin that the war had left with something finer and stronger than what had been there before. And Legolas brought elves from Ithilien, from the lands east of the Anduin, and they planted gardens and groves throughout the city, softening the white stone with green and growing things, weaving nature into the architecture, making Minas Tirith not just a fortress, but a garden city, a place where the beauty of the living world and the beauty of the built world existed together in harmony. The elves brought trees and flowers to the streets and the courtyards, and the White City, which had been a place of grim endurance for so long, became a place of beauty, a city where stone and leaf, craft and growth, the work of dwarves and the art of elves, were joined together in a single living whole. Can you see what is happening here? Two peoples who had been estranged for millennia, who had fought and mistrusted and misunderstood each other since the dawn of the world, working side by side to rebuild the greatest city in Middle-earth. Dwarves and elves, together, each bringing their particular gifts. The dwarves their mastery of stone and metal, the elves their mastery of growing things, and combining them into something neither could have created alone. A city that was both fortress and garden, both stronghold and sanctuary, built by the hands of the two peoples who had never been able to build anything together before. That is what Legolas and Gimli's friendship accomplished in the world. Not just a personal bond between two individuals, though it was that too. A practical, visible, tangible healing of one of the oldest wounds in Middle-earth. The rift between elves and dwarves. The ancient estrangement that had impoverished both peoples across the ages. In the rebuilding of Minas Tirith, that estrangement was, if not ended, at least answered, overcome, proven unnecessary. The two peoples could work together. Their gifts were complementary. And the world was better, literally, physically, visibly better, when they combined them. Part 7. The colony in Ithilien. While Gimli established his dwarf realm in the glittering caves, Legolas was building something of his own, an elven colony in Ithilien, the beautiful land east of the Anduin, between Minas Tirith and the mountains of Mordor. Ithilien had once been one of the loveliest lands in Gondor, a green and garden-like country, watered by mountain streams rich with trees and flowers. But the long shadow of Mordor had fallen on it, and across the years of the war. It had become a contested borderland, fought over and marred by the presence of the enemy. After the war, with the shadow lifted and the land free again, Ithilien was ripe for renewal, and Legolas saw in it an opportunity to create something new. He brought elves from his father's kingdom in the north, sylvan elves, wood elves, his own people, and established a colony in Ithilien, in the region that would come to be known as the most beautiful land in all the Western realms. Under Legolas's guidance, the elves of Ithilien restored the land to its former beauty and beyond, tending the forests, replanting the groves, healing the scars that the shadow had left, transforming a war-torn borderland into a place of elvish grace and natural splendor. And here is the thing about this colony that most people miss. It was not a retreat. It was not the elves withdrawing from the world into a hidden refuge, as they had done in Lothlorien and Rivendell. It was an elvish colony established in a land of men, beside the kingdom of men, as part of the new order of the world, an elven presence in the Fourth Age, the Age of Men, a bridge between the fading elven world and the rising human one. Legolas was not hiding. He was building, in cooperation with the King of Gondor, in partnership with the dwarves of the Glittering Caves, a new kind of relationship between the peoples of Middle-earth. The colony in Ithilien was, in a sense, the living expression of the Fellowship's legacy, a place where the alliance forged in the war was given permanent visible form, where elves and men and dwarves for the dwarves of Aglarond were near neighbours, lived in a proximity and a cooperation that had not existed since the Elder Days. It was a new thing in the world, a thing born from the friendships and the alliances of the war, and it lasted for many years, not forever, because nothing lasts forever in Middle-earth, and the elves were still fading, still feeling the pull of the West. But for a time, in Ithilien, under Legolas's care, there was a flowering of elvish beauty in the heart of the kingdom of men that must have been one of the most lovely things in all the Fourth Age. Part 8. The promise they kept. Between the Glittering Caves and Ithilien, between the dwarf realm in the south and the elven colony in the east, Legolas and Gimli kept a promise to each other that they had made during the war. A promise that captures the whole nature of their friendship in a single exchange. During the war, when they had argued about the relative beauty of the Glittering Caves and Fangorn Forest, Gimli enthralled by the caves, Legolas enthralled by the ancient trees, they had made a pact. After the war, they would visit each other's wonders. Gimli would take Legolas to the Glittering Caves, and Legolas would take Gimli to Fangorn Forest. Each would show the other the thing they loved, and each would try, genuinely, open-heartedly, to see the beauty that the other saw. And they kept the promise. After the war, Legolas and Gimli travelled together to both places, to the Glittering Caves, where Legolas saw the underground beauty that had captured Gimli's heart, and to Fangorn Forest, where Gimli walked among the ancient trees that Legolas loved. Each entered the other's world, not as a tourist but as a friend, willing to see, willing to be changed, willing to let the other's love expand their own understanding of what was beautiful in the world. This promise, and its keeping, is a small detail in the vast sweep of Tolkien's narrative. But it is, I think, one of the most important things that happened after the war. More important, in some ways, than the rebuilding of cities or the restoration of kingdoms. Because the promise was about something that lies at the root of all the conflict and all the healing in Tolkien's world. The willingness to see through another's eyes. The ancient enmity between elves and dwarves was, at its heart, a failure of vision. Each people seeing only its own kind of beauty and dismissing the others as lesser or false. The elves could not see what the dwarves saw in the stone. The dwarves could not see what the elves saw in the trees. And because neither could see the other's beauty, neither could fully respect the other. And the estrangement deepened across the ages into something that looked permanent and natural, as though elves and dwarves were simply too different to understand each other. Legolas and Gimli proved that was wrong. Not by arguing, not by philosophizing, not by making grand speeches about the unity of all peoples, by visiting each other's caves and forests, by looking, with genuine openness, at the thing the other loved, by allowing themselves to be moved by a beauty they had not expected to find. The promise was the act of two friends saying, "I will see the world through your eyes, and I trust that what I see there will be worth seeing." And when the promise was kept, when the elf walked the caves and the dwarf walked the forest, the ancient wall between their peoples cracked a little wider, and the light of a new understanding poured through. Part 8.5. The King Who Made It Possible. We should not tell the story of Legolas and Gimli's post-war accomplishments without acknowledging the figure who made much of it politically possible. Aragorn Elessar, the king who created the conditions in which an elf and a dwarf could work together to rebuild the world. Aragorn was the third member of the trio, the Three Hunters, as they were called during the pursuit of the Uruk-hai, who had travelled together through the middle stretch of the war. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli had formed a bond of their own during those desperate days of running across Rohan, and Aragorn's relationship with each of them was its own kind of bridge. He was a man who had been raised in Rivendell, among elves who spoke Elvish, who loved an elf, who understood the elven world as well as any mortal could. And he was also a descendant of Menor, a man of the ancient blood, whose people had worked with dwarves in the building of great cities, and who respected the dwarvish craft as few men did. Aragorn was, in his person, a bridge between all the peoples, and as king, he used that bridge deliberately to create a new order. It was Aragorn who granted Gimli the lordship of the Glittering Caves, granting a dwarf dominion over a territory within the bounds of his own kingdom, an act of trust and partnership that established a dwarf realm in the heart of the lands of men. It was Aragorn who welcomed Legolas's elven colony in Ithilien, inviting elves into the kingdom's heartland, giving them a home beside the great city, making the elven presence a formal and honoured part of the new Gondor. Without Aragorn's vision and his authority, the neighbouring realms of Aglarond and Ithilien might never have been established. Without his willingness to break precedent, to grant dwarves and elves permanent homes within the borders of a kingdom of men, the physical infrastructure of Legolas and Gimli's cooperation would not have existed. Aragorn understood what Legolas and Gimli's friendship meant, because he had seen it forged. He had watched the elf and the dwarf go from bristling at each other to standing side by side, and he knew, as a king and as a friend, that the bond between them was a resource more valuable than any army. By making room for that bond in the political structure of his kingdom, By granting Gimli his caves and Legolas his colony, and blessing the cooperation between them, Aragorn turned a personal friendship into a feature of the New Age. He institutionalized the alliance. He gave the friendship a home. Part 8 3/4. The Dwarves of Erebor and their unusual lord. There is a dimension of Gimli's post-war life that is worth imagining. Even though Tolkien gives us only the barest sketch of it, the dimension of Gimli's relationship with his own people, the Dwarves of Erebor and the Lonely Mountain, who must have found their kinsman's post-war choices unusual, to say the least. Gimli was a hero among dwarves. He was a member of the Fellowship, a warrior of renown, a companion of the king. His deeds in the war were the stuff of dwarvish legend, the battles, the loyalty, the courage. He had every right to a hero's welcome when he returned to his people, and he would have received one. But then he did things that no dwarf had ever done. He established his realm not in a traditional dwarf fold, not underground in the northern mountains, but in the caves behind a fortress in the lands of men. He maintained a lifelong friendship with an elf, a thing that his fellow dwarves could admire in the abstract, but that must have been, in practice, deeply strange to them. He spoke of Lothlorien with reverence. He wore 3 golden hairs in a crystal around his neck. He visited an elven colony regularly, and an elf visited his caves. And then, at the end of his life, he boarded an elven ship and sailed to the Undying Lands. This was, by dwarvish standards, incomprehensible. Dwarves do not love the sea. Dwarves do not sail in elven ships. Dwarves do not go to the Undying Lands. The very concept was foreign to dwarvish religion and dwarvish understanding of the world. Gimli's final voyage must have been to the dwarves of Aglarond and Erebor, the most bewildering thing their lord had ever done. The capstone of a life that had carried him further and further from the norms of his people, into a realm of experience that no dwarf had ever entered, and that the dwarvish understanding of the world had no framework to accommodate. And yet, they let him go. They did not stop him. They did not protest, or if they did, there is no record of it. They honored his choices, even the ones they could not understand, because Gimli had earned that honor through a lifetime of service and courage, and the clear evidence that his unusual path had made him not less of a dwarf, but more. A dwarf who had taken the gifts of his people and added to them the gifts of the wider world, who had become, through his friendship and his experiences, something that no dwarf before him had ever been, a dwarf of the world, a citizen of every people, a being who belonged not to one kingdom or one culture, but to the whole of Middle-earth. The dwarves of Erebor did not understand Gimli's final voyage, but they understood Gimli. And that was enough. Part 9. The Elf Among Men. Let us follow Legolas through the years of peace and trace what the world looked like through his eyes, because the experience of an immortal elf living in the Fourth Age, the Age of Men, is stranger and more sorrowful than it first appears. Legolas was an elf, and elves do not die of old age. They are bound to the world for as long as the world endures, and while they can be slain in battle. They do not sicken, do not age, do not fade in the way that mortal beings do. An elf watching the mortal world is a being on a different timescale, seeing the years pass like seasons, watching the mortals around them bloom and wither and pass in what feels, to an immortal, like the turning of a single long afternoon. And Legolas, living in Ithilien among the kingdom of men, watched the mortals he loved grow old. He watched the great warriors of war, the men who had fought beside him on the Pelennor, the soldiers who had marched to the Black Gate, the companions who had shared in the impossible victory. He watched them age, and weaken, and die. He watched their children grow and their grandchildren be born, and the memory of the war recede generation by generation, from living memory into legend. He watched the world change around him, while he, unchanging, stood still. And yet he stayed. For years, for decades, he stayed in Ithilien, and tended his colony and served the king, and kept his friendship with Gimli alive. He stayed because the work mattered, because the restoration of Ithilien and the building of the new age required his presence and his gifts. He stayed because his friendship with Gimli held him. He stayed because, despite the sea longing that pulled at him every day, despite the grief of watching mortals pass while he remained, there was still something worth doing in Middle-earth, still a reason to remain. But the sea longing never quieted. Every gull cry over the Anduin, every glimpse of the wide water, every breeze that blew from the west, they all carried the same message, the same pull, the same ache. The blessed realm was calling. The undying lands were waiting. And sooner or later, Legolas knew. He would have to answer that call. The only question was when, and whether he would go alone. Part 10. The Dwarf Among Mortals. Gimli's experience of the post-war years was different from Legolas's, but it carried its own particular kind of bittersweet weight, because Gimli, unlike Legolas, was mortal. But he was mortal on a very long clock, and the dwarves around him were tied to him in ways that made his unique experience both rich and isolating. Dwarves live longer than men. Gimli's ancestor Din Ironfoot had fought in the War of the Ring at the age of 252 before falling in the Battle of Dale, and so Gimli had many decades of active life ahead of him after the war. He spent those decades as the Lord of the Glittering Caves, leading his colony, overseeing the beautification of Aglarond, contributing to the rebuilding of Gondor, and maintaining the friendship with Legolas that was the anchor of his post-war life. But Gimli was changed by the war in ways that set him apart from his fellow dwarves, in ways that the dwarves around him could not fully understand. He had loved an elf lady. He carried 3 golden hairs in a crystal as the most precious thing he owned. He counted an elf prince as his closest friend. He spoke of the beauty of Lothlorien with a reverence that made other dwarves uncomfortable. He had been touched, through his friendship with Legolas and his encounter with Galadriel, by a dimension of beauty that most dwarves never experienced, and that the culture of his people did not have a good way of processing. This is the loneliness of the bridge. Gimli was the bridge between 2 worlds, the dwarvish world he came from and the elvish world he had been admitted to, and the cost of being a bridge is that you belong fully to neither side. His fellow dwarves respected him, honoured him, followed him. But they could not quite understand the thing that had happened to him in Lothlorien, the thing that had opened in him when he saw Galadriel, the dimension of his experience that went beyond anything in their tradition. Gimli was a dwarf who had been enlarged by the world, and the dwarvish community, for all its strengths, could not match the full breadth of what he had become. And so his friendship with Legolas was not just a bond of affection. It was a lifeline, the one relationship in which the whole of Gimli could be known, in which the dwarf who loved caves and the being who loved Galadriel and the warrior who counted orcs at Helm's Deep and the traveller who had walked through Lothlorien and Fangorn could all exist, together, without having to hide or explain any part of himself. Legolas knew Gimli whole, and being known whole, by even one being, is one of the rarest and most sustaining gifts that friendship can give. Part 11. The ancient enmity they healed. Let us step back and understand the full weight of what Legolas and Gimli accomplished by being friends, because the healing they brought about was not just personal, but historical, not just between 2 individuals, but between 2 peoples whose estrangement had impoverished both for millennia. The rift between elves and dwarves ran all the way back to the First Age, In the ancient city of Menegroth, the Thousand Caves, the great elven king Thingol had employed dwarves to help build his underground halls. And for a time, the two peoples worked together in harmony. But the collaboration ended in betrayal and blood. Thingol was killed by dwarves who coveted the Noglama, a great necklace of dwarf make into which a Silmaril had been set, and the dwarves sacked Menegroth. The elves retaliated, and from that point forward, the two peoples regarded each other with suspicion and hostility that varied in intensity but never fully healed. Thousands of years of this. Thousands of years of elves distrusting dwarves as greedy, stone-hearted, ungrateful. Thousands of years of dwarves resenting elves as arrogant, condescending, unwilling to see the value of anything that grew beneath the earth rather than above it. The cultural wounds passed from generation to generation, reinforced by each new incident of friction, deepened by each new misunderstanding, until the enmity seemed natural and permanent, as fixed a feature of the world as the mountains and the sea. And two friends, one elf, one dwarf, who happened to be thrown together by a quest, and who, against every expectation, discovered that they liked each other. Two friends quietly, gently, without any grand declaration, began to undo all of that. Not entirely. Not instantly. The rift between elves and dwarves was not healed by Legolas and Gimli alone. But the crack that their friendship opened in the ancient wall, the visible, undeniable proof that an elf could love a dwarf and a dwarf could love an elf, that the two peoples could work together and build together and see each other's beauty. That crack let the light in. It made possible the cooperation at Minas Tirith, the neighbouring colonies at Aglarond and Ithilien, the new pattern of interaction that the Fourth Age would carry forward. Legolas and Gimli did not end the enmity. They proved it was unnecessary. And sometimes, proving an enmity unnecessary is the most radical act of healing the world has ever seen. Part 11 and a half. The Noglama and the Weight of History. To appreciate how revolutionary Legolas and Gimli's friendship truly was, we should look more closely at the specific incident that cemented the ancient rift, because the wound was not vague or abstract. It was specific, bloody, and remembered with precision by both peoples for thousands of years. In the First Age, in the great underground kingdom of Menegroth, the Thousand Caves, the beautiful realm of King Thingol and Queen Melian in the land of Doriath, dwarves and elves had worked together in one of the few genuine collaborations between the two peoples. The dwarves of the Blue Mountains helped Thingol build his underground halls, and the collaboration produced something magnificent. A dwelling that combined elvish beauty with dwarvish craft, a place of wonder that was the pride of both peoples. But the collaboration ended in catastrophe. Thingol came into possession of a Silmaril, one of the three great jewels, the most beautiful and most coveted objects in the history of the world, and he asked the dwarves to set the Silmaril in the Noglama, a great necklace of dwarvish make. The dwarves did the work, and the result was breathtaking, the greatest jewel in the greatest necklace, elvish treasure combined with dwarvish craft. But when the work was done, the dwarves coveted the result. They wanted the necklace, with the Silmaril for themselves. Thingol refused. Words were exchanged. Violence erupted, and in the darkness of Menegroth, the dwarves killed Thingol, the great elf king, the husband of Melian, one of the most important figures in elvish history, and they took the necklace and fled. The elves pursued them. Battles were fought. The necklace changed hands. Blood soaked the ground. And from that point forward, the relationship between the two peoples was poisoned at its root. Every elf knew the story of Thingol's murder. Every dwarf knew the story of their own grievance, the refusal to give them what they felt was owed, the violence that followed. Each people had its own version of the events, its own sense of being wronged, its own reasons for the distrust that hardened, generation after generation, into something that felt permanent. Thousands of years of this inherited grievance. The blood on the floor of Menegroth, echoing down the ages, colouring every interaction between elf and dwarf, turning every meeting into a potential confrontation, every negotiation into a test of old wounds. Thranduil imprisoned the dwarves in his halls, partly because of this ancient memory. Gimli's own suspicion of the elves was shaped by stories his father and his father's father had told, stories that reached all the way back to the Thousand Caves and the Norglammer, and the moment when the partnership between the peoples was shattered by greed and by blood. The wound ran in both directions, and neither people was blameless. The dwarves had killed a king. The elves had retaliated with devastating force, destroying the dwarvish cities of the Blue Mountains, recovering the necklace in a campaign that the dwarves remembered as an act of genocidal vengeance. Each side nursed its own version of the story. Each side carried its own sense of having been wronged. And the distance between the two versions, the elvish story and the dwarvish story, the murdered king and the dispossessed craftsman, the theft and the unjust refusal, was the space in which the ancient enmity lived and breathed and reproduced itself, generation after generation, until no living elf or dwarf could remember a time when the two peoples had been at peace. This is the specific historical weight that Legolas and Gimli carried on their shoulders when they stood together in the Fellowship. Not a vague cultural tension, but a wound of specific, remembered violence, passed down through their respective peoples with the precision and the passion that only the deepest grudges command. Every elf knew about Thingol's death. Every dwarf knew about the sack of their cities. And every encounter between the two peoples was shadowed by those memories, those stories, those wounds that had never healed, because neither side had been willing to let them. Legolas and Gimli's friendship was forged against this specific weight of history, not against a vague sense of cultural difference, but against the memory of a murdered king, a stolen necklace, a partnership destroyed by violence. The wall they breached was built of specific stones, laid by specific hands, cemented by specific grievances. And the fact that they breached it anyway, that friendship could overcome even this much history, even this much blood, is what makes their story so remarkable. They did not breach a misunderstanding. They breached a genuine, historically grounded, deeply felt grievance that had shaped the identities of both peoples for thousands of years. And they did it with nothing but honesty, mutual respect, and the gradual discovery that the being across the ancient line was worth knowing. Part 12. The grief of Aragorn's passing. The years passed and the world changed and the friends lived on, Legolas unchanging, Gimli growing old with the slow and dignified aging of his kind. And then came the day that changed everything, the day that set the final chapter of their story in motion. Aragorn died. Aragorn Elessar, king of the reunited kingdom of Gondor and Arna, the greatest king of the age, the man who had led the free peoples to victory and ruled in wisdom and strength for 120 years, Aragorn chose to die. This is one of the most remarkable moments in Tolkien's world, and it is often passed over too quickly. Aragorn did not die of illness or of age in the ordinary sense. He was of the line of Minor, gifted with a span of years far beyond that of lesser men, and he retained his strength and his clarity almost to the very end. But when he felt his time approaching, when he sensed that his years were drawing to their natural close, he chose to yield his life willingly, to lay down his kingship and his life in the old manor of the Nadain, at the time of his own choosing, with dignity and grace. He said farewell to Arwen, his queen, and to his children, and he went to the house of the kings, and he lay down, and he died. For Legolas and Gimli, who had travelled beside Aragorn since the beginning, who had fought with him and built with him and loved him, the loss was enormous. Aragorn had been the centre of the post-war world, the king around whom the New Age was built, the living proof that the Fellowship's victory had meant something lasting and real. His death was not just the loss of a friend. It was the end of an era, the final closing of the chapter that began at Rivendell, when 9 companions set out to destroy the ring. And for Legolas, Aragorn's death carried a particular weight. Because Aragorn was the last great anchor holding Legolas to Middle-earth. With Aragorn gone, with the king dead and the era ended, the sea-longing surged in Legolas with a force it had never had before. The mortal world was releasing him. The friends he had stayed for were passing. The work he had done was, if not complete, at least established well enough to continue without him. There was less and less to keep him on this side of the sea, and more calling him from the other side. But Legolas did not leave alone. He could have. He was an elf. The grey havens were open to him. The ships waited, and his right to sail was unquestioned. He could have gone west by himself, as so many elves before him had done, leaving Middle-earth behind, leaving the mortal world to the mortals, sailing home at last to the land where the sea-longing would be answered and the ache in his heart would find its rest. But there was Gimli, Part 13. The last sailing. And here we come to the moment that I have been building toward all evening. The single most astonishing, most beautiful, most quietly world-shattering thing that happened in the aftermath of the War of the Ring. It is a thing that Tolkien mentions almost in passing, in the appendices, in a few brief lines that carry, for those who understand their full weight, the impact of a thunderclap. After the death of Aragorn, Legolas built a ship. He built it in Ithilien, in his elven colony, with the craft of his people, a grey ship, a swan ship, the kind of vessel the elves used to sail the straight road to the Undying Lands. And when the ship was ready, Legolas sailed west. But he did not sail alone. He took Gimli with him. A dwarf, on an elven ship sailing to the Undying Lands. A dwarf crossing the sundering seas, taking the straight road to the Blessed Realm, entering the land of the Valar, the country of the deathless. This had never happened before. In all the long history of the world, no dwarf had ever sailed to the west. The Undying Lands were not the homeland of the dwarves, as they were the homeland of the elves. The dwarves were the children of all, made by the smith rather than created by Ilúvatar, though Ilúvatar had adopted them and given them life, and their fate after death was a mystery even to the Valar. They were said to go to the halls of Mandos and to await a time when all would need them, at the remaking of the world after the final battle. The Undying Lands were not their destination, not their right, not their place, and Gimli went there anyway. Because Legolas took him. Because their friendship was so strong, so real, so completely beyond the boundaries of what anyone had thought possible between an elf and a dwarf, that it carried Gimli across the sea, to the one place no dwarf had ever been or was ever meant to go. And here is the part that makes this not just remarkable, but sacred. Tolkien suggests, and the tradition of the lore holds, that Gimli was admitted to the Undying Lands through the grace and the intercession of Galadriel. Galadriel, the Lady of the Golden Wood, the elf queen who had given Gimli 3 golden hairs, who had recognized in this gruff dwarf a heart capable of the purest kind of love. Galadriel spoke for Gimli, or wished for his admittance, and the Valar, or the grace that governs such things, allowed it. A dwarf. In Valinor. Because an elf queen loved his heart, and an elf prince loved his friendship and the barriers between the peoples, which had stood for millennia, were, in this one astonishing instance, dissolved entirely by the simple, world-breaking power of love. Part 14. What it meant for a dwarf to sail west. Let us stay with this for a moment, because the full weight of Gimli's sailing needs to be understood, not just as a nice gesture or a sentimental ending, but as something that, within the logic of Tolkien's world, should have been impossible, and that its happening tells us something profound about the nature of grace. The Undying Lands were the domain of the Valar and the Elves. They were not a place that just anyone could go. The whole history of Menor's destruction was, at its core, the story of men trying to go to the Undying Lands by force and being catastrophically punished for it. After the drowning of Menor, the world was changed, bent into a sphere, and the straight road to the west was removed from the reach of mortal ships. Only the elven ships, sailing the straight road by a grace given to the firstborn, could reach the Undying Lands. The road was not open to men, and it was not open to dwarves. So Gimli's sailing was not just unusual. It was, by every established rule of the world, not supposed to be possible. A mortal on the straight road, heading for the land where mortality had no place. The rules said no. The history said no. The whole architecture of the world said no. And yet Gimli went. Because the rules, for all their weight, were not absolute in the face of grace. Tolkien's world is a world where the established order can be broken, not by force, as the Inmemorians tried and failed, but by grace, by the quiet working of love and the favour of the powers that govern the world. Gimli did not storm the Undying Lands. He did not demand entry. He was carried there by an elf ship, admitted by grace, welcomed because the powers that govern such things recognized in his friendship and his love something that the rules did not account for, and that the rules, in this one case, could bend to accommodate. This is the theological heart of the story of Legolas and Gimli. The rules of the world are real. The boundaries between the peoples are real. The architecture of creation is real. But love is also real, and love, in Tolkien's vision, has a power that the rules do not fully contain. Love can carry a dwarf across the sea. Love can open doors that history has closed and that custom has locked. Love can break the boundaries that seemed permanent and reveal them to be, in the final reckoning, less fundamental than the love that crosses them. Gimli sailed to the Undying Lands not because the rules allowed it, but because love was, in the end, stronger than the rules. And that quiet, gentle, worldview-shaking truth is the real ending of the story of Legolas and Gimli. The friendship that began with an axe and a bow and a grudging tolerance at the Council of Elrond ended with a dwarf on an elven ship sailing toward eternity, admitted to the blessed realm by the grace of a queen he had loved and the fidelity of a friend he had trusted. The rules said no, love said yes. And love won. Part 15. Why Galadriel's role matters. The connection to Galadriel, the thread that runs from the 3 golden hairs in Lothlorien to the dwarf on the ship sailing west, is the hidden spine of the whole story. And understanding it fully reveals something about the nature of the grace that made Gimli's sailing possible. Galadriel's gift to Gimli, the 3 hairs, freely given to a dwarf, when the greatest of the elven smiths had been refused, was not just a kindness. It was a recognition. Galadriel, with her ancient wisdom and her sight that pierced the surface of things, saw something in Gimli that she had not seen in Fëanor. Something in the dwarf's heart, in his unguarded and completely sincere devotion, that was finer and more worthy than the brilliant but possessive desire of the greatest elf who ever lived. Fëanor had wanted the hairs for himself, for his craft, for the making of things. Gimli wanted them for love, simple, selfless, reverent love. The love of a being who saw beauty and asked only to carry a token of it with him. not to possess it or use it, but simply to remember it. And Galadriel, who had watched the elves' own greatest craftsman ask for her hair, and had refused because she sensed in his desire the seed of something possessive and dangerous. Galadriel gave her hair to Gimli because she sensed, in his desire, nothing but the purest love. The Elf Queen's judgment was that the dwarf's heart was truer than the greatest elf's, and she honoured that truth with a gift that carried the weight of ages. That gift and the judgment it expressed is, I believe, the foundation on which Gimli's admission to the Undying Lands rests. When Galadriel spoke for Gimli at the end, if that is how it happened, Tolkien leaves the exact mechanism unclear. She was not doing a favour for a charming dwarf. She was completing the act she had begun in Lothlorien, the recognition that this dwarf's love was worthy, that his heart was true, that the boundaries between elf and dwarf were less important than the quality of the soul that stood before her. She recognized Gimli in Lothlorien, and the recognition carried him all the way to Valinor. And this connects to the story's larger theme in a way that is almost unbearably beautiful. The greatest grace of the whole story, the admission of a dwarf to the Undying Lands, was earned not by might, or by craft, or by any conventional heroism, but by love. Gimli did not sail west because he was a great warrior, though he was. He did not sail because he was a lord of his people, though he was. He sailed because he loved purely, because his heart was recognized by the one being whose recognition mattered, and because that recognition, that grace, that favor, carried him across the barriers that the whole history of the world had erected between his kind and the Blessed Realm. The dwarf who loved the Elf Queen's beauty found, at the end, that his love was the key to a door that no dwarf had ever opened. And the door opened not because Gimli forced it, but because love had already unlocked it, long ago in a golden wood, when a queen gave 3 hairs to a dwarf and changed the rules of the world forever. Part 16. The Fading of the Elves and Legolas's Choice. To understand why Legolas waited as long as he did before sailing, and why his sailing, when it came, was both a departure and a fulfillment, we have to understand the larger context of what was happening to the elves in the Fourth Age. Because Legolas's choice was not made in isolation. It was made against the backdrop of a whole people's departure from the world. The elves were leaving Middle-earth. This had been happening for a long time. Throughout the Third Age, the elven population of Middle-earth had been dwindling as more and more elves answered the call of the West and sailed to the Undying Lands. But after the War of the Ring, the departure accelerated. The 3 elven rings which had sustained the elven refuges of Rivendell and Lothlorien lost their power when the One Ring was destroyed. The enchantment that had preserved those places faded, and with it faded the reason for many elves to remain in Middle-earth. The Age of the Elves was ending. The Age of Men was beginning. And the elves, whose time in Middle-earth had been immeasurably long and immeasurably beautiful, were going home. Galadriel herself sailed west shortly after the war, along with Elrond and Gandalf and Frodo, on the ship that departed from the Grey Havens in one of the most famous and most sorrowful scenes in all of literature. The great elven lords of the Third Age, the beings who had kept the elven presence in Middle-earth alive through the long centuries of the shadow, were leaving, and the world they left behind would never quite be the same. The magic was fading, the enchantment was withdrawing. The world was becoming more ordinary, more human, more mortal, with every elf that sailed. And Legolas felt all of this. He was an elf of the sylvan kind, a wood elf, tied to the forests and the green world. He felt the fading in the land around him, the slow withdrawal of the enchantment, the dimming of the ancient light. He knew that his time in Middle-earth was limited, not by mortality as Gimli's was, but by the larger movement of history, the turning of the ages, the great tide of the world carrying the elves away from the mortal lands and toward their final home in the West. His choice to stay as long as he did, to remain in Ithilien, to tend his colony, to work alongside men and dwarves, to keep his friendship with Gimli alive across the long decades, was, in this context, an act of remarkable commitment. He stayed not because the sea longing was absent, but because other things mattered enough to offset it. The work, the friendships, the building of the new age. He chose, deliberately and at great personal cost, to be one of the last elves in Middle-earth, to remain when so many of his kind had already gone, to carry the elven presence into the Fourth Age as a gift, rather than as a relic. And when he finally sailed, after Aragorn's death, after the era was truly ended, his sailing was not a flight. It was a completion. He had done what he stayed to do. He had built the colony, tended the land, served the king, kept the friendship. And now the work was done, and the sea was calling, and it was time. Not to flee, but to finish. Not to abandon Middle-earth, but to leave it having given it everything he had to give. Part 16 and a half. The world they were leaving behind. When Legolas and Gimli finally prepared to depart, the world they were leaving was profoundly different from the one they had saved. The Fourth Age was, by the time of Aragorn's death, well established, a world of men, a mortal world, a world in which the enchantment was fading and the practical, earthbound concerns of human governance and human ambition were taking the place of the older, stranger order that had governed the Third Age. The elves were almost gone. Rivendell was empty or nearly so, its halls echoing with memories rather than with the voices of the living. Lothlorien had faded. The golden light that had sustained it through the Third Age was withdrawn with the passing of Nenya, Galadriel's ring, and the golden wood had become an ordinary forest. Beautiful still, but no longer enchanted, no longer preserved in the timeless beauty that had made it one of the wonders of the world. The elven refuges that had dotted Middle-earth were closing, one by one, their inhabitants sailing west, their halls returning to the earth, their songs falling silent. The dwarves were changing too. Erebor still stood, the great kingdom under the lonely mountains still thriving, but the wider dwarvish presence in the world was shifting. The glittering caves of Aglarond, Gimli's realm, would continue under new leadership after his departure. But the unique character he had given it, the combination of dwarvish craft and dwarvish reverence. The partnership with the elves next door would be harder to maintain without the lord who had embodied it. And the friendships that had connected the peoples during the war and the early years of the Fourth Age were becoming memories. The fellowship was gone. Gandalf and Frodo had sailed long ago. Sam had followed. Merry and Pippin had died in Gondor. Aragorn had yielded his life, and Boromir had been dead since Amon-Hen. The bonds that had held the coalition together were personal bonds, and the persons were passing, and what was left was institutional, treaties, alliances. The political structures that Aragorn had built, which were good and necessary, but which lacked the warmth and the personal force of the friendships they had replaced. Legolas and Gimli, in this context, were among the very last living connections to the world that had been, the world of the War of the Ring, the world of the Fellowship, the world where elves and dwarves and men and hobbits had fought together and built together and loved each other across the lines that history had drawn between them. Their departure would mark the final closing of that chapter. After them, the Fourth Age would be fully and completely the Age of Men, a world without elven colonies, without dwarvish lords who loved elven queens, without the living memory of the impossible friendships that had saved the world. That is the bittersweet context of their sailing. They were not just leaving Middle-earth, They were leaving a version of Middle-earth that was already, in many ways, gone, a world that had existed for a brief and precious window of time between the ending of the war and the final departure of the old peoples. A world in which all the races had worked together as they never had before, and never would again. Legolas and Gimli's departure was not the end of that world. That world had already ended. They were the last reminders that it had existed at all, and when their ship sailed beyond the horizon, the reminder went with them, and the world of men was left to remember or forget as it chose. Part 17. What Gimli gave up. When Gimli boarded that elven ship, he was giving up everything he knew, and I want to sit with that for a moment, because the full weight of what Gimli sacrificed to take that voyage is often lost in the beauty of the ending. Gimli was a dwarf. His whole being, his culture, his craft, his understanding of the world was rooted in the earth, in stone, in the deep places. The Undying Lands were not his home. They were not shaped for his people. The beauty there, the light of the two trees preserved in memory, the singing of the Ainur, the timeless perfection of a realm that existed outside the weariness of the mortal world, this was elvish beauty. Beauty that Gimli had learned to love, but that was not native to him, not designed for him. Not the kind of beauty his soul was built to inhabit in the way a dwarf mansion or a deep cavern was. Gimli was leaving the earth, not just the physical earth of Middle-earth, but the earth in the spiritual sense, the stone, the metal, the deep roots of the mountains, the hidden wonders of the underground that were the dwarves' particular inheritance and particular love. He was leaving the glittering caves, the greatest work of his life, the caverns he had tended and beautified and made into a wonder of the new age. He was leaving the community of dwarves he had led, the people who looked to him as their lord. He was leaving the world he understood, the world he was built for, the world that fit the shape of his soul. And he was going to a place where he would be, in every sense, a stranger. The only dwarf in the Undying Lands, the only dwarf who had ever been there. Surrounded by elves, by beings whose nature and whose history were fundamentally different from his own, in a realm that was made for them and not for him, where even the beauty, and there would be so much beauty, would be beauty of a kind that was not his people's kind. That is what Gimli gave up to sail with Legolas. He gave up belonging. He gave up the comfortable fit of being among his own people, in his own element, in the world that was shaped for his kind. He exchanged the deep familiarity of the earth for the strange splendor of a realm that was not meant for dwarves. Because his friendship with Legolas and his love for Galadriel were, in the final reckoning, more important to him than belonging. He chose love over comfort, friendship over familiarity, the unknown over the known. And the courage that took, the courage of a dwarf leaving the stone and the earth behind forever, boarding a ship on the open sea, and dwarves do not love the sea, sailing toward a horizon he could not see, and a destination he could barely imagine. That courage is, in its quiet way, as great as any heroism on any battlefield. Part 18. What Legolas gave up. But Legolas gave up something too, and it is worth naming. Because the easy reading of the story is that Legolas got what he wanted, he sailed west, he answered the sea longing, he went home to the Blessed Realm. And that is true as far as it goes. But by taking Gimli with him, by making the voyage a shared journey rather than a solitary homecoming, Legolas made a choice that was not without cost. Legolas chose to enter the Undying Lands not as an ordinary elf returning home, but as the elf who brought a dwarf. That is a distinction with weight. The relationship between the Valar and the dwarves was complicated. The dwarves were not Ilúvatar's original plan for the children. They were All's creation. adopted by the one but always standing slightly apart from the other peoples in the economy of the world. Bringing Gimli to Valinor was not a neutral act. It was a statement, a request, a test of grace, and Legolas made it knowingly, choosing to tie his own homecoming to the fate of his dwarvish friend. Accepting that his arrival in the West would be complicated by the presence of a being who, by every rule, should not have been on the ship. Legolas chose friendship over simplicity. He could have sailed alone, answered the sea longing quietly, arrived in the West as just another elf coming home. Instead, he chose to carry his friend with him, to complicate his own return for the sake of the bond they shared. And that choice, the choice to make room for the other, to bind your own fate to someone else's, to refuse the easy and uncomplicated path because the person you love needs the complicated one, that is itself a kind of heroism, quiet and unsung and as real as any sword stroke. Part 19. The ship they built. There is a detail about the ship Legolas built that is worth dwelling on. Because the building of the ship is itself a story, and it tells us something about the kind of elf Legolas had become by the end of his long sojourn in Middle-earth. Legolas built the ship in Ithilien. He built it with his own hands and with the help of his elven colony in the green land by the Anduin, far from the sea. This was not how elves normally sailed. The traditional departure point for the elves was the Grey Havens, Mithlond, the harbour on the Gulf of Lune, where Credan the shipwright had been building and maintaining elven ships since the First Age. Elves who wished to sail west went to the Grey Havens, boarded one of Credan's ships, and departed under the guidance of the ancient mariner who had been sending the elves home for thousands of years. But by the time Legolas sailed, the Grey Havens may have been diminished. The great harbour that had served as the departure point for the elves throughout the Third Age may no longer have had the community and the infrastructure to support the traditional sailings. Círdan the shipwright, the ancient mariner who had built and maintained the elven ships for ages, had vowed to remain until the last ship sailed. But whether he was still at his post or had already departed by the time Legolas was ready, we cannot know for certain. So Legolas built his own ship. He constructed it inland, on the banks of the Anduin, and sailed it down the river and out to sea and across the sundering waters to the west. There is something wonderfully independent about this, and something that speaks to the particular kind of elf Legolas had become. He was not an elf of the great houses, not a Noldo or a Teleri with a tradition of seafaring. He was a sylvan elf, a wood elf, a being of the forests who had never before the war had any particular connection to the sea. And yet here he was, building a ship, learning the craft of ship, building perhaps from the last remnants of elvish lore, constructing his own vessel for his own voyage, taking charge of his own departure, rather than relying on the old institutions that had managed such things in the past. This is an elf who has been changed by the Fourth Age, who has learned, in his long years among men and dwarves, the self-reliance and the practicality that his mortal companions embodied. The wood elf who built a ship is not the same elf who arrived at the Council of Elrond. He has been shaped by his friendships, by his experiences, by the dwarf who taught him to see beauty in stone, and the men who taught him to build for the future. The ship Legolas built was itself a product of the friendships that would sail upon it, a vessel made possible by the changes those friendships had wrought in the elf who built it. Part 20. The Theology of the Voyage. Let us go deeper into what Gimli's admission to the Undying Lands actually means within the theological structure of Tolkien's world, because this is not a simple and they lived happily ever after ending. It is a statement about the nature of grace and the limits of the created order that has profound implications for Tolkien's entire vision. In Tolkien's world, the created order is deliberate. Ilúvatar created the elves for one purpose, and the men for another, and the dwarves for yet another, with all's help. Each people has its own destiny, its own afterlife, its own relationship to the world and to the divine. The elves are bound to the world until its ending. Men pass beyond the world through death, to a fate that even the Valar do not know. And the dwarves, the adopted children, all's creation given life by Ilúvatar, have their own mysterious fate, awaiting all in the halls of Mandos until the world is remade. The Undying Lands, Valinor, are specifically the home of the Valar and the elves. They are not the afterlife for anyone. They are a physical place within the created world, but a place outside the normal flow of time, preserved in the ancient beauty of creation, accessible only to those the world's order has designated. Men cannot go there. The destruction of Menor proved that. Dwarves were never meant to go there. So Gimli's arrival in the Undying Lands is, from a theological perspective, a disruption of the created order. A moment when the rules of the world, which are real and meaningful, bend to accommodate something the rules did not anticipate. The friendship of an elf and a dwarf, and the bending is not forced. It is graceful, allowed, permitted, welcomed by the powers that maintain the order, because the love that seeks admittance is genuine, and the heart that bears it is worthy. This tells us something essential about Tolkien's theology. The created order is not the final word. The rules are real, but they are not absolute. Above the rules, above the order of creation, above the fates assigned to each people, above the boundaries that divide elf from dwarf from man, there is grace. And grace can bend the rules when love requires it, can open doors that custom and law have closed, can admit the unexpected visitor whose heart proves worthy of admittance. Tolkien was a Catholic, and this theology is not accidental. The idea that the created order is good, but not ultimate, that grace can transcend the law, that love can open doors that justice would keep closed, these are deeply Catholic ideas, and they are woven into the very fabric of Tolkien's world. Gimli's sailing to the Undying Lands is not just a beautiful ending for a beloved character. It is a theological statement that the world is structured by order and governed by grace, and that when the two are in tension, grace prevails. Part 21. The friendship that no one expected. Let us sit for a moment with the sheer improbability of what we are describing. Because the friendship of Legolas and Gimli was, by every measure available to the peoples of Middle-earth, one of the most unlikely things that could have happened, and that improbability is itself part of the point. An elf and a dwarf. These are not just different individuals. They are representatives of two peoples whose natures, whose cultures, whose fundamental orientations toward the world are profoundly and perhaps irreducibly different. Elves love the surface and the sky. Dwarves love the underground and the earth. Elves are immortal. Dwarves are mortal. Elves sing. Dwarves forge. Elves grow things. Dwarves shape things. The differences go all the way down to the very structure of their created natures, and the history between them, millennia of suspicion and conflict, has solidified those differences into an enmity that looks permanent. And yet two beings, one from each side of this ancient divide, manage to find in each other something to admire, something to respect, something to love, not by ignoring their differences or pretending they did not exist, but by discovering, underneath the differences, a shared capacity for beauty, for loyalty, for the kind of love that crosses boundaries, because it is more interested in the beloved than in the boundary. The improbability is the grace, the fact that it should not have happened, that every force in the history of the world was working against it, makes the happening of it all the more meaningful. Legolas and Gimli's friendship is not a triumph of sameness. It is a triumph of love over difference, of the heart over the habit, of the personal over the historical. They do not agree about everything. They do not see the world the same way. They will never stop being an elf and a dwarf, with all the differences that implies. But they love each other anyway, across the differences, through the differences. Not in spite of the differences, but in a way that makes the differences part of the richness rather than part of the problem. And that is why their friendship matters beyond the borders of the story, because the world is full of ancient enmities, of peoples who have been taught to distrust each other, of boundaries that look permanent and natural, but that are, in truth, nothing more than the accumulated weight of history and habit. And Legolas and Gimli, the elf and the dwarf, the prince of the forest and the lord of the caves, show us that those boundaries can be crossed. Not by force, and not by pretending they do not exist, but by the simple, patient, world-changing act of seeing the other truly and loving what you see. Part 22. Gimli and the Three Hares. I want to return to the three hares one more time, because there is a detail about how Gimli treated them that tells us everything about the quality of his love and why Galadriel was right to give them to him. Gimli asked Galadriel for a strand of her hair because he wanted to set it in crystal, to encase it, to preserve it, to carry it as a token of beauty, a visible reminder of the thing he had seen in the golden wood. He did not want to use the hairs. He did not want to work them into a great craft, as Fëanor would have done, weaving them into a creation of his own, turning the gift into material for his making. Gimli wanted to treasure them. Just treasure them. Carry them. Look at them. Remember, this is the key to Gimli's love, and it is the key to why his love was recognized and rewarded by the powers of the world. Gimli's love was not possessive. It was not acquisitive. It was not the love of the craftsman who sees beautiful material and thinks, what can I make from this? It was the love of the pilgrim who sees a holy thing and thinks, I want only to carry the memory of this with me, forever. The love that asks for nothing except the privilege of remembering. The love that does not grasp or use or transform, but simply holds, in reverence, the image of the beautiful. And this is exactly the quality of love that the ring corrupted in everyone it touched. The ring worked by finding desire and inflating it, by turning the love of something into the desire to possess it, to control it, to bend it to your will. The ring corrupted love by making it possessive. And Gimli's love was the precise opposite. Love that was complete in itself, that wanted nothing from the beloved except the beloved's existence, that carried 3 golden hairs in a crystal not because they gave him power, but because they reminded him of beauty. In a world where possessive love was the root of almost all the evil, where the desire to possess the Silmarils drove the wars of the First Age, where the desire to possess the ring drove the war of the Third Age, Gimli's non-possessive, reverent, grateful love was something extraordinary. It was the antidote to the poison of the ring, the counterexample to every grasping and consuming desire that had driven the villains of the story. And it is fitting, I think, that this kind of love, the love that does not grasp but only carries, does not possess but only remembers, is the love that carried a dwarf all the way to the Undying Lands. The quality of love that was the opposite of the ring's corruption was the quality of love that broke the final barrier and opened the final door. Part 23. The Friendship and the Fellowship. Legolas and Gimli's friendship was the strongest bond within the Fellowship, stronger, in some ways, than any other pairing among the 9 companions. And understanding why requires us to look at the full range of relationships within the company and to appreciate what made the elf-dwarf bond unique. The hobbits had each other, Frodo and Sam, Merry and Pippin, bound by the deep ties of the Shire, held together by a love that was rooted in their shared home and their shared nature. Their bonds were beautiful and powerful, but they were bonds between like and like, hobbits with hobbits. Beings who understood each other instinctively, who shared a culture and a worldview and a set of values that made their friendship natural and expected. Aragorn stood somewhat apart, a leader more than a friend to most of the company, carrying the weight of his destiny. Bonded to Gandalf by the long history of the Rangers and the Wise, connected to the hobbits by his guardianship, but not quite belonging to any pair or group within the Fellowship. But Legolas and Gimli's bond was something different from all of these, a bond between unlike and unlike, between beings who should not have been friends, who came from cultures that actively discouraged friendship with the other, who had to build their bond from scratch, with no shared culture or shared instinct to rely on. Their friendship was earned in a way that the hobbits was not, constructed through deliberate choice and mutual recognition, in a way that the easy bonds of shared background never have to be. And because it was earned so hard, because it had to overcome so much, because it was built on the bedrock of genuine recognition, rather than the comfortable soil of shared culture, it proved to be the most durable, the most world-changing, the most theologically significant friendship in the whole company. The hobbits' friendships changed the hobbits. Legolas and Gimli's friendship changed the world, changed the relationship between two peoples, changed the rules of who could enter the Undying Lands, changed the possibility of what elves and dwarves could be to each other. The bond between like and like is beautiful and sustaining. But the bond between unlike and unlike, the bond that crosses the boundary, that bridges the gap, that builds something new between two worlds that had never been connected, that is the bond that reshapes the map of the possible. And that is what Legolas and Gimli built, through war and peace and the long years of the Fourth Age, all the way to the ship and the sea. Part 23 and a half. All's child comes home. There is a dimension of Gimli's sailing that is almost never discussed, and it is the one that moves me most. The thought of what Gimli's arrival in Valinor might have meant to All. All was the Valar who made the dwarves. In the deep past, before the children of Ilúvatar awoke, All, the great smith, the Valar of craft and making, grew impatient for the coming of the children, and, in his eagerness, fashioned the dwarves from the stone of the earth. He gave them form and substance, and the beginnings of independent will. And Ilúvatar discovered what All had done, and rebuked him, gently, firmly, and All, in his grief and his submission, raised his hammer to destroy his creations. But Ilúvatar stayed his hand. The dwarves had been given life not by All alone, but by Ilúvatar's own mercy, which adopted them and gave them true being. The dwarves were not Ilúvatar's original plan. They were All's children, adopted by the One, and given a place in the world alongside the elves and the men for whom the world had been designed. All loved his children. He had made them with his own hands, shaped them with his own skill, given them his own love of craft and making. And then he had given them up, released them into the world, watched them wander and build and delve and make war and love beauty in their own dwarvish way, separated from their maker by the gulf between the blessed realm and the mortal lands. For all the long ages of the world, All's children lived in Middle-earth, far from the land where their maker dwelt, and All, the smith who loved them, watched from afar. And then Gimli came, a dwarf, on an elven ship, sailing to the Undying Lands, sailing home, in a sense that Gimli himself might not have fully understood, to the land where the Valar who had made his people dwelt. Gimli was coming to Ol's doorstep, a child of all, carried by the grace of Galadriel and the love of Legolas, crossing the sea that had separated the dwarves from their maker since the beginning of the world, arriving in the land where the smith sat among his forges and his anvils and waited, with the patient love of a father, for the children he had made so long ago. Whether Gimli met Ol in the Blessed Realm, Tolkien does not say. But the thought of it, the thought of the dwarf from the lonely mountain, the son of Glyn, the lord of the glittering caves, standing at last in the presence of the Vala who had shaped his people from the stone of the earth, is almost too moving to contemplate. The child comes home to the maker. The craft of the dwarves, expressed in Gimli's long life of making and tending, returns to the source of all dwarvish craft. And the love that Ol had for his children, the love that had made him forge them in the first place, the love that had nearly led him to destroy them when Ilúvatar rebuked him, the love that had sustained them across all the ages of the world, that love found. In Gimli's arrival, its most personal and most intimate expression, not a whole people, but one dwarf, arriving on a grey ship, carrying 3 golden hairs in a crystal, ready at last to meet the hand that made him. And there is one more layer to this that deserves attention. Ol was the Vala of craft, and Gimli was, above all else, a craftsman, the lord of the glittering caves, the dwarf who had tended the underground beauty of Aglarond with the reverence of an artist, the builder who had helped forge the gates of Minas Tirith in mithril and steel. Gimli brought with him, to the Blessed Realm, the fruit of Ol's gift. Not the raw desire to make things, which every dwarf shared, but the refined, mature, world-experienced expression of that gift, craft tempered by war, informed by friendship with elves, enlarged by the encounter with beauty that was not stone beauty, but light beauty and living beauty. Gimli carried back to Ol a version of the dwarvish craft that was greater than what Ol had originally given, because it had been expanded by the world, enriched by friendship, touched by the grace of Galadriel. In a sense, Gimli brought Ol a gift in return for the gift of creation. He brought the maker what the making had become, the fullest possible expression of dwarvish capacity, a dwarf who had loved stone and loved beauty and loved an elf and loved a queen, who had fought in wars and built in peace and seen the world from every angle a dwarf could see it from, and a few angles no dwarf had ever seen before. Gimli returned to his maker not as a raw creation, but as a finished work, a masterpiece of experience and love and courage, the finest thing the dwarvish nature had ever produced. And if all could see his child and know what his child had become, the smith of the Valar might have wept with the pride and the joy of a maker whose creation had surpassed his original design. Part 24. The Quiet Revolution. What Legolas and Gimli accomplished together was, in its quiet way, a revolution, and I want to name it as such, because it is easy to miss its significance amid the louder dramas of the War of the Ring. The war was fought to defeat Sauron, to destroy the Ring, to save the free peoples from domination. And it succeeded, magnificently and at great cost. But the war's victory was essentially negative. It removed a threat, it ended a danger, it cleared the board of the great evil that had loomed over the world. What it did not do, by itself, was build anything new. Defeating Sauron did not heal the ancient wounds between the peoples. It did not undo the mistrust between elves and dwarves. It did not create the cooperation that the New Age needed. It only made the cooperation possible by removing the obstacle. The building was done by others. The building was done by Aragorn, who united the kingdoms and restored the line of the kings. The building was done by Sam, who went home and planted a garden and served as mayor of the Shire 7 times over, tending the small world that the Great War had been fought to save. And the building was done by Legolas and Gimli, who took the alliance forged in war and made it real in peace. who demonstrated through their shared work on Minas Tirith and their neighbouring colonies and their lifelong friendship that the cooperation of the Fellowship was not a temporary wartime expedient, but a permanent new reality. Their revolution was quiet. It did not involve battles or declarations or the overthrow of old orders. It involved a dwarf visiting an elf's forest and an elf visiting a dwarf's caves. It involved dwarves and elves working side by side on the walls of a city. It involved two friends who refused, for the rest of their very long lives, to let the ancient enmity between their peoples define or limit their relationship. Small things, quiet things, things that no one wrote songs about at the time. But those quiet things changed the world more lastingly in some ways than the great battles. Because the war's victory was temporary, the shadow was thrown back, but the world goes on, and new shadows will come. The friendship's victory was permanent, the proof that elves and dwarves could love each other, could work together, could see each other's beauty, was a fact that could not be unproven, a precedent that could not be erased. The war saved the world for a time. The friendship changed what the world was capable of, forever. Part 25. The contests that continued. One of the most charming and most human, or elvish, or dwarvish aspects of Legolas and Gimli's post-war life is that they never stopped competing. The competitive spirit that had first expressed itself in the orc-counting contest at Helm's Deep continued in mellower forms throughout the decades that followed, and the continuation of the competition is, in its way, as important as the great deeds. After the war, the competition shifted from orc-killing to beauty-finding. Gimli would describe the wonders of the glittering caves in extravagant dwarvish detail, and Legolas would counter with the beauties of Fangorn Forest or the green valleys of Ithilien. Each of them would argue, with passionate and only slightly exaggerated conviction, that his own wonder was the greater, that the crystals of Aglarond surpassed any forest glade, or that the ancient trees of Fangorn made any cave look barren by comparison. The arguments were never settled, because they were never meant to be settled. They were performances of affection, rituals of friendship, the way two very proud and very stubborn beings expressed their love for each other in the only language their pride permitted. And the competitions expanded. When they visited each other's realms, which they did regularly, travelling between Aglarond and Ithilien throughout the decades of peace, each would try to impress the other with some new discovery or some new work of beauty. Gimli would reveal a newly opened chamber in the caves, a formation of crystals that he had uncovered with months of patient work. Legolas would show Gimli a grove he had planted, a stand of mallan trees that he was trying to grow in the southern climate. Each gift was both a boast and an offering. A boast because each was saying, "Look what I have found. Look what my craft can do," and an offering because each was saying, "This beauty is for you. I found it, or made it with you in mind." The competition between them was the ongoing heartbeat of the friendship, the steady rhythm that kept the bond alive across the long years when the great events were over and the daily business of living and building replaced the drama of the war. Friendships need ongoing expression, ongoing engagement, ongoing reasons to be maintained. And for Legolas and Gimli, the competition was that expression, the constant, playful, affectionate contest that kept them talking, kept them visiting, kept them engaged with each other across the distance and the difference that separated their very different lives. And here is the thing about the competition that I find most moving. It required each of them to understand the other's values well enough to compete within them. Gimli could not impress Legolas with a crystal he thought was beautiful if Legolas did not understand what made crystals beautiful. Legolas could not impress Gimli with a grove he was proud of if Gimli did not understand what made groves worth being proud of. The The competition forced each of them, constantly, to inhabit the other's world of beauty, to learn the other's aesthetic language, to develop the capacity to see what the other saw. The orc counting was easy. Both of them understood killing orcs. The beauty finding was harder and more important because it required each of them to grow toward the other's understanding, to expand their own capacity for appreciation. To become, in a sense, partly elvish if you were a dwarf and partly dwarvish if you were an elf. The competition made them bigger. It made them more than they would have been alone. And it did so playfully, through the gentle art of boasting and one-upmanship, through the time-honored tradition of friends trying to impress each other, which is, when you look at it closely, one of the great engines of growth and self-improvement that friendship provides. Part 26. The losses along the way. The post-war years were not all building and competing and the gentle cultivation of a friendship in peacetime. There were losses, real, grievous, accumulating losses that marked the passage of time, and that gave the story of Legolas and Gimli its particular tone of sweetness touched with sorrow. The mortals died. All of them. The companions of the Fellowship, the warriors of the war, the builders of the New Age, they all, one by one, reached the end of their mortal spans and passed beyond the circles of the world. And Legolas, the immortal, watched them go. He watched the hobbits grow old in the Shire, or heard of it, from the messengers and the travellers who carried news between the distant corners of the kingdom. Sam and Rosie, growing old together in Bag End, surrounded by their children. Merry and Pippin, the lords of their respective corners of the Shire, aging with the dignity and the good humour of hobbits who had seen the world and come home with stories no one quite believed. And then, one by one, they passed. Sam sailing west at last. Merry and Pippin riding south to Gondor and dying in the fullness of their years, laid to rest in the House of the Kings. He watched the men of Gondor pass. Faramir, Prince of Ithilien, Legolas's near neighbour and friend, who had lived a long and good life in the land they both tended. Owen, the shield maiden who became a healer, who had found peace in the gardens of Ithilien after the fire of the Pelennor. The soldiers, the captains, the friends, all of them passing, one generation after another, while Legolas remained. And Gimli, though he lived longer than any man, was mortal too. As the decades turned into centuries, even Gimli's dwarvish strength began to wane. The hands that had swung the axe at Helm's Deep grew stiff. The eyes that had seen the glittering caves with such wonder grew dim. The voice that had boasted and challenged and laughed with Legolas through all the long years grew quieter. Gimli was aging. Slowly in the dwarvish way, but aging nonetheless. And Legolas, the immortal elf, watched his closest friend grow old. This is the particular sorrow of the elf who loves mortals. The elves call it the gift of men, mortality, the freedom to leave the world. But for the elf who watches a beloved mortal age and decline, it does not feel like a gift. It feels like a loss, a theft, a cruelty woven into the structure of the world. The mortals you love will die. You will not. And the friendship that sustained you through war and peace and the long work of the years will end. For them, while you go on. That is what Legolas was living with in the long decades after the war. The sea longing pulling him west, the mortals he loved growing old around him, the world fading, changing, becoming more mortal and less enchanted with every passing year. And through it all, the friendship with Gimli, the one bond that had survived every other loss, the one relationship that had not yet been broken by time, sustaining him, anchoring him, giving him a reason to stay even as everything else was telling him to go. Part 27. Why Legolas waited for Gimli. There is a question that the story raises but never directly answers, and I think it is the most important question about the whole ending. Why did Legolas wait? Why did he not sail west decades earlier, when the sea longing first became unbearable, when the other great elves had already departed, when Middle-earth was fading and the call of the West was growing stronger with every passing year? Why did he stay? The answer, I believe, is Gimli. Legolas stayed for Gimli. He stayed because the sea longing, powerful as it was not the only force acting on him. The friendship was a force too, a pull as real as the pull of the West, a claim on his heart as strong as the claim of the undying lands. And Legolas chose, for decades, to honor the friendship over the longing, to stay in the mortal world because the friend he loved was still in the mortal world, to endure the ache of the sea calling because the alternative, leaving Gimli, sailing without him, abandoning the friend who had stood beside him through everything, was worse. This is not a small thing. The sea longing, for an elf, is not a gentle wistfulness. It is a deep and relentless hunger, a calling that penetrates every moment of every day, that colors every experience with the knowledge that you are in the wrong place, that your true home is elsewhere, that every beauty you see in the mortal world is a pale shadow of the beauty that awaits you across the sea. To resist the sea longing for decades, to choose to remain in a fading world when the unfading realm is calling, to endure that constant, grinding, soul-level ache, because your friend still has years to live, and you will not leave him. That is an act of love so profound that it is hard to find words for it. Legolas waited for Gimli the way you wait for someone you love, not because waiting is pleasant, but because going without them would be worse. The undying lands could wait. The sea longing could be endured. The ache could be borne. But leaving Gimli behind? That could not be borne. And so Legolas stayed, and endured and waited, year after year, decade after decade, until the time came. Until Aragorn was dead, and the era was over, and Gimli was old enough and ready enough, and the moment was right. And then they went together. The waiting is the love, the enduring is the friendship, and the fact that they sailed together, that Legolas did not go alone but waited until he could take his friend with him, is the final proof of what their bond meant, that no home, not even the blessed realm itself, was worth arriving at if the one you loved most was not beside you when you arrived. Part 28. The Last Goodbye. When Legolas and Gimli sailed from Middle-earth, they were saying goodbye to a world they had helped to save and to build. And the goodbye was final in a way that few goodbyes are, because they were not just leaving a place. They were leaving a reality, a mode of existence, a whole way of being in the world. They were leaving the mortal lands for the immortal, the changing for the changeless, the world of time for the world beyond it. They would not be back. What did they leave behind? The glittering caves, tended by Gimli's people but without their lord. The colony in Ithilien, maintained by the elves who remained but losing its guiding spirit. The rebuilt walls and gates of Minas Tirith, the physical legacy of their cooperative craft. The friendships they had made across decades of peace, the men and women of Gondor and Rohan who had known the Elf Lord and the Dwarf Lord as figures of the new age, as legends made flesh, as the living proof that the old enmities could be healed. And they left behind the world itself, Middle-earth, the mortal lands, the place where their friendship had been forged and tested and proven. The Fellowship had walked these lands, and the companions had built upon them, and now the last two members of the Fellowship to remain in Middle-earth were departing together, on a grey ship, down the river and out to sea. After them, there would be no one left in Middle-earth who had stood in the circle at Rivendell and sworn to protect the ring-bearer. The fellowship would exist only in memory, in the Red Book, in the songs, in the stories that the peoples of the Fourth Age would tell and retell across the years. The sailing of Legolas and Gimli was the last chapter of the fellowship's story. It was the final departure, the last farewell, the closing of the book that had been opened when 9 companions set out from Rivendell in the winter of the year 3018. And it was fitting, deeply, perfectly fitting, that the last 2 to leave were the elf and the dwarf, the friendship that should have been impossible and that proved to be the most enduring of all. The hobbits had gone home. The wizard had departed. The king had died. And the last 2 standing, the last 2 to walk the earth they had saved, were the 2 who loved each other enough to sail together into the unknown, leaving behind everything they knew, for the sake of a bond that not even the sundering sea could break. Part 28 and a half. The voyage. We know almost nothing about the voyage itself, the actual sailing, the days or weeks on the water between the shores of Middle-earth and the Blessed Realm. Tolkien tells us only that it happened, that the ship sailed, that it found the straight road, that it arrived in the west. But we can imagine what it was like, based on what we know of the 2 beings who made it. And the imagining is worth doing, because the voyage itself, the time between departure and arrival, the space between the mortal world and the immortal, is a kind of metaphor for everything their friendship was. Picture the ship on the open sea. A grey elven ship, built with craft and love, carrying 2 passengers. An elf who knew the sea and longed for it, and a dwarf who had never been on the open water and who must have found the experience, the vastness of the ocean, the absence of stone, the constant motion, the horizon stretching endlessly in every direction without a mountain or a cave in sight, profoundly disorienting. Dwarves do not love the sea. Their hearts belong to the stone, to the firm and the solid, to the things that do not move. The ocean is the antithesis of everything a dwarf finds comforting, and Gimli sailed on it anyway, because his friend was at the helm, and his love was stronger than his discomfort. Imagine the conversations they must have had, on the long voyage across the sundering seas. An elf and a dwarf, alone on the water, with nothing to do but talk and wait and watch the horizon for the light of the blessed shore. What did they talk about? The war, perhaps, the old stories, retold and remembered, the battles relived, the companions mourned, the years of peace, the caves, the colony, the gates of mithril and steel. Galadriel, certainly, the Lady of the Golden Wood, toward whom they were sailing, whose grace had made the voyage possible. Perhaps they were silent for long stretches, the elf watching the stars and the dwarf watching the elf, each one finding comfort in the other's presence, even when there was nothing to say. And imagine the moment when the light appeared on the horizon, the light of the undying lands, the first sight of the blessed shore, the radiance that no mortal eye had seen since the drowning of Menor. Legolas would have wept, perhaps, the elvish joy of homecoming, the answering of the longing that had tormented him for decades, the final resolution of the ache that had lived in his heart since the gulls cried at Pelagia. And Gimli, what did Gimli feel, seeing that light for the first time? The dwarf who had entered this voyage out of love and friendship, not out of any longing of his own. What was it like for him to see the shore of the undying lands, the place he was never supposed to reach, the realm that existed beyond every boundary his people had ever known? Perhaps he was afraid. Perhaps he was awed. Perhaps, in that moment, all the courage he had shown in the mines of Moria and on the walls of Helm's Deep and on the fields of the Pelennor seemed small compared to the courage of standing on the deck of an elven ship, watching the shores of eternity draw near, and trusting that the friend beside him and the queen ahead of him and the grace that had carried him this far would be enough to carry him the rest of the way. Part 28 3/4. The Dwarf on the Water. There is a particular kind of bravery that Gimli showed in boarding that ship, a kind that is easy to miss because it is not the bravery of battle, not the bravery of the dramatic moment, but the quiet bravery of stepping into the completely unknown. Gimli had been brave his whole life. He had faced orcs and trolls and the Balrog's shadow and the hosts of Mordor. He had walked the paths of the dead. He had stood on the walls of fortresses that were falling around him and swung his axe until his arms burned. Physical courage, the courage of the warrior, the courage that faces death and does not flinch, was Gimli's native element. He had it in abundance. It was as natural to him as breathing. But the ship required a different kind of courage. It required the courage to leave behind everything he knew and understood, to step outside every category his culture had prepared him for, to go where no dwarf had gone and where no dwarf was expected to go. It required him to trust not in his strength, because strength could not carry him across the sea, but in friendship, in grace, in the love of an elf prince and the favour of an elf queen, and the mercy of the powers that governed the blessed realm. He had to surrender control completely, to put himself in the hands of others, to become a passenger rather than a captain, a guest rather than a lord. For a dwarf, a being whose whole culture celebrated self-reliance, whose whole identity was built around the mastery of craft and the dominion of stone, this was a harder kind of courage than any battlefield demanded. And Gimli showed it. He stepped onto the ship. He trusted. He let himself be carried by the water and the wind and the elvish craft and the grace that had called him toward a destination he could not see and could not prepare for and could barely imagine. The warrior became a pilgrim. The lord became a guest. The master of stone became a traveller on water. And the courage that made this possible was the truest courage Gimli ever showed, truer than Helm's Deep, truer than the Pelennor, because it required him to be not just brave in the face of danger, but humble in the face of mystery, to set aside every certainty his life had given him, and to sail, on trust alone, into the unknown. Part 29. What they found in the West. What happened when Legolas and Gimli arrived in the Undying Lands? Tolkien does not tell us, not in detail, not with the specificity that the rest of the story provides. The voyage and the arrival are shrouded in the kind of silence that Tolkien uses when he reaches the edge of what his story can properly contain. The point where the mortal narrative gives way to something that lies beyond its capacity to describe. But we can imagine, based on what we know of the Undying Lands, what the arrival might have been like. For Legolas, it would have been a homecoming, the answering of the sea longing, the arrival at the shore he had been yearning for since the gulls cried at Pelagia, the light of the Undying Lands, brighter and cleaner and more vivid than any light in Middle-earth. The presence of the Valar, the great powers of the world, dwelling in the Blessed Realm. The elves who had gone before, Galadriel, Elrond, the countless thousands who had sailed across the ages. For Legolas, the West would have been the end of aching, the resolution of the longing, the answer to the question that had been humming in his elvish heart since that day on the river. And for Gimli? For Gimli it would have been something entirely new. Something for which no dwarf had any precedent, no expectation, no frame of reference. The Undying Lands were not designed for dwarves. The beauty there was elvish beauty, the beauty of light and song and the presence of the divine. And Gimli, for all his capacity for wonder, for all the expansion that Galadriel's gift and Legolas's friendship had worked in him, was still a dwarf, a being of stone and earth and the love of deep things. What would the Undying Lands look like to dwarvish eyes? What would they feel like to a dwarvish heart? Perhaps, and this is speculation, because Tolkien gives us no answer, perhaps Gimli found in the Undying Lands a beauty that was both strange and familiar. A beauty that was not stone and crystal, but that shared with stone and crystal the quality that Gimli loved most. The quality of permanence, of endurance, of things that do not fade. Perhaps the unchanging light of Valinor spoke to the part of Gimli that had always loved the things that last. The things carved in stone, the things wrought in metal, the things that time cannot erode. Perhaps the dwarf who loved the glittering caves found, in the unchanging splendor of the Blessed Realm, a different kind of cave. Not underground, but filled with light. Not hewn from rock, but made of song, but carrying the same quality of timelessness. The same assurance that this beauty will endure. And perhaps this is the image I find most moving. Gimli found Galadriel there. The Lady of the Golden Wood, in the land of her birth, in the full splendor of the Blessed Realm, more beautiful than she had been even in Lothlorien. And perhaps Gimli looked upon her again, for the first time since the Golden Wood, and the three hairs in the crystal caught the light of Valinor. And the dwarf wept again, not with the bittersweet joy of the mortal world, but with the full and uncontaminated joy of a being who has come, at last, to the place where beauty does not fade. We do not know. Tolkien does not tell us. But the silence itself is a kind of answer. The silence of a storyteller who has brought his characters to the edge of something that stories cannot quite contain, and who trusts us to imagine the rest. Part 30. The Tolkien Pattern. Legolas and Gimli's friendship fits into a broader pattern that Tolkien wove through all of his work, a pattern of unlikely alliances, of boundaries crossed, of connections forged between peoples that history and culture had separated. And understanding this pattern helps us see the full significance of what the elf and the dwarf accomplished. Throughout Tolkien's work, the most important things are accomplished by alliances of the unlike. The Fellowship itself was the supreme example, 9 beings from 5 different peoples, thrown together by necessity, bound by a common purpose, accomplishing together what none of them could have accomplished alone. The destruction of the ring required hobbits and men and elves, and a dwarf and a wizard, each contributing something the others could not provide. The war was won not by any single people, but by the cooperation of all of them. And the cooperation was possible only because individuals were willing to cross the boundaries of their peoples and trust each other. Legolas and Gimli are the most vivid illustration of this pattern at the personal level. Their friendship is the Fellowship's principle made flesh, the principle that the cooperation of the unlike is not just useful but sacred, that the bonds forged across the boundaries of people and culture are not just alliances of convenience, but the highest expression of what the peoples of the world can be to each other. When Legolas and Gimli work together on Minas Tirith, when they visit each other's caves and forests, when they compete and boast and argue and love each other across the distance of elf and dwarf, they are doing, in miniature, what the whole Fellowship did in the large, proving that the world is better when its peoples work together, when the boundaries come down, when the ancient enmities are set aside in favor of the new and untested possibilities of friendship. This is Tolkien's great hope for the world, and he expressed it most fully through Legolas and Gimli. Not through grand declarations of peace between nations, not through treaties or alliances or the political machinery of cooperation, but through the friendship of 2 individuals who should not have been friends, and who changed the world because they were. The personal is the political. The friendship is the alliance. The elf and the dwarf, arguing about caves and forests, are the living proof that the world can be different, that the enmities that seem permanent are not, that the boundaries that seem fixed can be crossed, that the love of 2 friends can reshape the possible. Part 31. what they missed about each other. For all the beauty of their friendship, there is a dimension of poignancy in the relationship between Legolas and Gimli that should not be overlooked, because even the closest friendships have their blind spots, their gaps, their places where the other's experience remains at some level. Inaccessible, Legolas could never fully understand what it meant to be mortal. He could watch Gimli age, could see the signs of time on his friend's face and hands, could understand intellectually that Gimli's time was limited in a way his own was not. But he could not feel it. He could not know from the inside what it is to live with the awareness that your years are numbered, that the candle is burning down, that every day you spend is a day you do not get back. Legolas was immortal, and mortality, for all his sympathy, remained an abstraction, a thing he observed in others but did not share, a grief he felt second-hand but never first-hand. And Gimli could never fully understand the sea longing. He could see that it tormented Legolas. He could hear the change in his friend's voice when the wind blew from the west, could see the distant look in his eyes when the gulls cried. But he could not feel the pull, the soul-deep calling, the ache of a being torn between the world where his friends lived and the world where his nature belonged. The sea longing was an elvish experience, as specifically and irreducibly elvish as the love of stone was dwarvish, and Gimli, for all his love, could not fully enter it. These gaps did not damage the friendship. They lived alongside it, accepted and accommodated, part of the landscape of a relationship between two fundamentally different kinds of beings. But they gave the friendship its particular tone of bittersweet richness, the richness of a bond that held fast even across the places where understanding could not quite reach, that was sustained not by perfect comprehension, but by the trust that the incomprehensible parts were real and worthy of respect, even when they could not be shared. This is, I think, true of all the deepest friendships, that they contain, alongside the shared understanding, pockets of irreducible difference, places where the friend's experience is a closed book that you can hold but not read. And the mark of a great friendship is not the absence of these gaps, but the willingness to honor them, to say, I cannot follow you into that part of your experience, but I trust that it is real and I will stand beside you through it. Legolas stood beside Gimli through his mortality. Gimli stood beside Legolas through his sea longing. And neither of them fully understood the other's burden, but both of them carried it anyway, because that is what friends do. Part 32. The end of the fellowship. The sailing of Legolas and Gimli was, as I said, the end of the fellowship, the final closing of the story that began in Rivendell. And I want to sit with the full weight of that closing, because it marks the end of something that the world of Middle-earth would never see again. The Fellowship of the Ring was 9 companions, 4 hobbits, 2 men, an elf, a dwarf, and a wizard. They were the product of a specific moment in history, a moment of extreme danger, when the cooperation of all the free peoples was necessary for survival, when the old barriers between the peoples had to be broken down to meet the common threat. The Fellowship was an emergency measure, a desperate coalition, thrown together in haste and held together by a shared purpose that, once achieved, would dissolve the bond that had formed it. But the bond did not dissolve. That is the miracle of the Fellowship, that the relationships forged in the emergency outlasted the emergency, that the friendships built under the pressure of the quest survived the lifting of the pressure and continued, deepened, enriched the lives of the companions for decades after the ring was gone. The Fellowship's purpose ended when the ring was destroyed. The Fellowship's friendships never ended. They endured across the rest of the companions' lives, sustaining them, connecting them, binding them to each other across the distances and the differences that the post-war world would create. And the last thread of that binding was the friendship of Legolas and Gimli. When they sailed together, the last living bond of the Fellowship was severed from Middle-earth and carried west. No more companions remained, no more living memories of the quest, of the road from Rivendell, of the snows of Caradhras and the mines of Moria and the golden light of Lothlorien, and the desperate battle at the Pelennor and the suicidal march to the Black Gate. All of it passed with the sailing of the ship from living memory into history, from the experience of the living into the lore of the dead. And yet the Fellowship endured. In the Undying Lands, Legolas and Gimli would have found, or could have found, the others who had sailed before them. Gandalf, who had departed with Frodo and the other ring-bearers. Frodo himself, healed at last of his wounds. Sam, who had sailed in his old age to be reunited with his master. The three elven ring-bearers, Galadriel, Elrond, and Gandalf, who had departed at the end of the Third Age. In the west, the scattered members of the Fellowship could be gathered again. Not all of them. Not Aragorn and Boromir and the mortal companions who had passed beyond the world's circles, but some of them, the ones whose fates had carried them to the same final shore. Perhaps that is the truest ending of the Fellowship. Not the breaking at Amon Hen, not the victory at the Black Gate, not even the sailing from the Grey Havens, but the quiet reunion in the Undying Lands, where the companions who had been separated by death and distance and the turning of the ages found each other again, on the shore of the sea, in the light of a world that does not fade. Part 33. The Elf Who Loved Stone. One of the things that makes Legolas and Gimli's friendship so remarkable is the way each of them was changed by the other. Not forcibly, not through argument or persuasion, but through the slow osmosis of proximity and love. They grew toward each other across the years, each one absorbing something of the other's way of seeing, until the elf who had always loved trees had learned to love stone, and the dwarf who had always loved caves had learned to love forests. Legolas, who arrived at the Council of Elrond as a wood elf of the purest tradition, a being of leaves and starlight and the green canopy of the woodland realm, ended his time in Middle-earth as an elf who had spent decades living near the glittering caves, who had visited them often, who had seen the underground beauty of Aglarond through Gimli's eyes, and found there a wonder he had never expected to find beneath the earth. The elf who had grown up in the trees learned through friendship with a dwarf to appreciate the beauty of the underground, the crystal formations, the play of light on mineral surfaces, the vast and silent architecture of the caves. He did not stop loving trees. But he added to his love of trees a new capacity, a new dimension of appreciation that his dwarvish friend had opened in him. This kind of growth is rare, and it is precious. Most beings go through life seeing the world through the single lens they were born with, never adding new lenses, never expanding their capacity for beauty beyond the boundaries their nature set for them. Legolas, through his friendship with Gimli, gained a second lens, the dwarvish lens, the capacity to see beauty in stone, and the world became richer for him because of it. The elf who could see beauty in two kinds of things, in the green of the forest and in the glitter of the cave, was a larger being than the elf who could see beauty in only one. Gimli made Legolas larger. That is what friends do. Part 34. The Dwarf Who Loved Leaves. And Gimli, in the same way, was enlarged by Legolas. The dwarf who had walked into Lothlorien with his hand on his axe walked out of the Fourth Age as a being who had spent decades living near an elvish colony, who had walked the groves of Ithilien, who had seen the beauty of living, growing, changing things through Legolas's eyes, and found there a dimension of the world he had never known he was missing. The dwarves as a people had a limited appreciation for the surface world, not through any fault of character, but through the simple fact that their nature was oriented differently, toward the underground, toward the hard and the lasting, toward the beauty that endures unchanged across the millennia. Trees change. Forests grow and die and grow again. The surface world is a world of flux, of seasons, of impermanence. And the dwarves, whose hearts were set on permanence, on the enduring, on the things that time cannot erode, naturally gravitated away from the surface and toward the stone. Gimli learned, through Legolas, to see beauty in the impermanent, to appreciate a flower that would bloom for a season and be gone, to find wonder in a forest that was always changing, always growing, never the same from one year to the next, to understand that impermanence was not a flaw but a quality, that the beauty of growing things was, in part, the beauty of their vulnerability, their mortality, their willingness to change and to pass, and to make room for what came after. This was a profound shift for a dwarf, and it could only have happened through the particular kind of exposure that friendship provides. You cannot learn to see through another's eyes by studying their perspective in a book. You can only learn it by loving someone who sees differently, by standing beside them in the presence of beauty and watching how it moves them, by letting their delight become a gateway to your own. Gimli learned to love leaves because Legolas loved leaves, and because Gimli loved Legolas, and because the love between them was strong enough and open enough to serve as a channel through which each could enter the other's world. Part 35. The world they built together. Let us take a final accounting of what Legolas and Gimli actually built together in the decades after the war. Because the physical legacy of their friendship is, in its way, as remarkable as the spiritual one. They rebuilt the walls and the gate of Minas Tirith, the greatest city of men, restored and beautified by the combined craft of elves and dwarves. The gate of mithril and steel, forged by Gimli's dwarves, was a wonder of the age, a statement, in metal, of what dwarvish craft could achieve when it was given a worthy purpose and a worthy partnership. The gardens and the groves planted by Legolas's elves softened the white stone of the city and made it a living place, a place where craft and nature existed in harmony. They established two neighbouring realms, the glittering caves of Aglarond and the elven colony of Ithilien, that stood as living proof of what elf-dwarf cooperation could look like in peace. Two realms, side by side, each ruled by a member of the Fellowship, each expressing the particular genius of its people, each enriching the other by its proximity and its partnership. The dwarves of Aglarond and the elves of Ithilien were neighbours, collaborators, partners in the work of the New Age, and their cooperation was the direct outgrowth of the friendship between their lords. They created a precedent, the visible, undeniable, living precedent of an elf and a dwarf in friendship, working together, building together, enriching the world together. This precedent mattered, because precedents change what people believe is possible. Before Legolas and Gimli, the idea of elf-dwarf friendship was almost inconceivable, a joke, a contradiction in terms, something that the history of the world rendered absurd. After Legolas and Gimli, it was a fact, proven, demonstrated, visible in the rebuilt walls of Minas Tirith and the neighbouring realms of Aglarond and Ithilien. The world's understanding of what was possible between the two peoples was permanently expanded by the friendship of two individuals, and they gave each other the gift of the journey itself, the long, companionable, arguing and boasting and visiting and building journey of a lifetime spent in friendship, enriched by difference, sustained by love, carried at last to the shores of the undying lands and beyond. That is a legacy that no wall or gate or garden can match. The greatest thing Legolas and Gimli built together was not a city. It was a friendship. And the friendship outlasted everything else, outlasted the walls, the caves, the gardens, the mortal world itself, because the friendship was built not of stone or leaf, but of something that does not fade. Part 36. Why this story gets overlooked. For all its beauty and significance, the post-war story of Legolas and Gimli is one of the least told parts of Tolkien's legendarium. Most retellings of the story stop at the coronation of Aragorn, or at the sailing of Frodo, and treat everything that comes after as epilogue, an afterthought, a tying up of loose ends, not really part of the story proper. And I think this is a mistake, and I want to say why. The story of Legolas and Gimli after the war is not epilogue. It is the fulfillment, the working out of the great themes of the story in the context of peace, where the things that were fought for during the war are actually built and lived and tested. The war was fought to save the free peoples and to give them a future. The post-war years are that future. And in that future, the most important work is not the remembering of the war, but the building of the peace. The slow, patient, unglamorous work of restoring what was damaged, cultivating what was planted, and creating the new relationships and new possibilities that the war made possible. Legolas and Gimli's post-war story is the story of the peace. It is the story of what happens after the swords are sheathed and the armies go home and the real, difficult, ongoing work of living together begins. It is not as dramatic as the war. It does not have the battle scenes, the desperate quests, the moments of high tension that make for gripping narrative. But it is, in its quiet way, just as important, because the whole point of the war was to make the peace possible, and if the peace is not built, the war's victory is hollow. The rebuilding of Minas Tirith. The founding of the Elven colony. The dwarf realm in the glittering caves. The friendship that carried an elf and a dwarf through decades of shared work and mutual enrichment. These are not footnotes to the great story. They are its conclusion, the demonstration that the victory meant something, that the world the war saved was worth saving, that the relationships forged in crisis could become the foundations of something lasting and good. And the sailing to the undying lands is not a postscript. It is the final, astonishing, world-redefining act of a friendship that was the living heart of the piece. We tell the war stories because they are exciting. We should tell the peace stories too, because they are true, truer perhaps than the war stories, because they show us what the war was actually for. Part 37. The gift that kept being given. Galadriel's 3 golden hairs, the gift she gave to Gimli in Lothlorien, were not just a one-time gift. They were a gift that kept being given across the whole arc of Gimli's life, because the grace they represented kept expanding, kept reaching into new territory, kept breaking barriers that had seemed permanent. The first giving was in Lothlorien, the hairs themselves, the recognition that a dwarf's love could be purer than an elf's ambition. The second giving was the change in Gimli's heart, the opening that Galadriel's beauty worked in him, the capacity for wonder and reverence that her gift awakened, and that made the friendship with Legolas possible in its full depth. The third giving was the friendship itself, the bond between elf and dwarf that grew from the crack Galadriel had opened in the ancient wall, the bond that proved the wall was not permanent. The fourth giving was the cooperative work, the rebuilding of Minas Tirith, the neighbouring realms, the visible proof that the opened crack could become a doorway through which 2 peoples walked toward each other. And the fifth giving, the final, most astonishing one, was the sailing to the undying lands, the admission of a dwarf to the blessed realm. the grace that Galadriel extended or interceded for, the opening of the last and greatest door by the same love that had opened the first door in the Golden Wood. 5 givings from a single gift, 3 golden hairs, and they remade the relationship between 2 peoples, rewrote the rules of who could enter the Undying Lands, and carried a dwarf to eternity. That is the nature of grace in Tolkien's world. It does not come in measured doses, calculated to achieve a specific effect. It comes in abundance, overflowing its initial gift, expanding beyond its original occasion, reaching further and further into the world with consequences that the giver herself may not have foreseen. Galadriel gave 3 hairs to a dwarf, and the gift carried him, in the end, all the way to Valinor. Part 38. What it means for us. I have been telling this story as a tale of Middle-earth, because that is what it is. But stories do not stay inside their borders, and the story of Legolas and Gimli reaches, I think, into our own world, and speaks to our own experience in ways that are worth naming. We all live in a world of ancient enmities, not between elves and dwarves, but between peoples, between cultures, between groups of human beings who have been taught, by history and habit, to distrust each other. The enmities take different forms: racial, cultural, national, religious, political, but they share the same structure: a long history of grievance, a culture of suspicion, a set of assumptions about those people that have been reinforced across generations until they feel natural and permanent, as fixed as the mountains and the sea. And the story of Legolas and Gimli says, they are not fixed, they are not permanent, they are not natural. They are the accumulated weight of history and habit, and they can be broken, not by force, not by policy. Not by grand declarations of peace and understanding, but by the patient, personal, one relationship at a time work of getting to know someone from the other side of the wall and discovering that they are, beneath the differences, worthy of love. This is not a naive hope. It is a hard-won conviction, expressed through 2 characters who had to earn their friendship against enormous resistance. The resistance of their own cultures, their own histories, their own instincts and assumptions. Legolas and Gimli did not become friends easily. They had to fight for it, not against each other, but against the whole weight of the past that told them friendship was impossible. And they won. Not by ignoring the past, but by refusing to let it have the final word. Not by pretending the differences did not exist, but by discovering that the differences were less important than the things they shared. That is the message of Legolas and Gimli's story, and it is a message that our world needs to hear as much as Middle-earth ever did. The walls between peoples are real, but they are not eternal. The enmities are deep, but they are not bottomless. And the power to cross the wall, to bridge the gap, to discover the friend on the other side of the ancient divide. That power lives in every single one of us, waiting, like Gimli's love in Lothlorien, for the crack through which it can pour and change the world. Part 39. The Tolkien who wrote this ending. There is a reason Tolkien wrote this ending for Legolas and Gimli, a reason that goes beyond the needs of the narrative and into Tolkien's own convictions about the world and about the nature of friendship. Tolkien was a man who believed in the power of personal relationships to heal what institutions could not. He had lived through 2 world wars. He had seen the devastation that hatred between peoples could cause. He had watched the ancient enmities of Europe, the national rivalries, the ethnic hatreds, the cultural prejudices, produce destruction on a scale that beggared imagination. And he did not believe that the healing of those wounds would come from treaties or from politics or from the machinery of international cooperation, useful as those things might be. He believed the healing would come from friendship from the slow, personal, individual work of human beings getting to know each other across the lines of division and discovering, against all expectation, that the other was not the enemy, but the friend. Legolas and Gimli are Tolkien's testament to that belief. They are his portrait of what friendship can do when it crosses the lines that history has drawn, when it refuses to accept that the enmity is natural, that the boundary is permanent, that the peoples cannot be reconciled. They are his proof that the work of peace is personal, that reconciliation happens one friendship at a time, that the walls come down not when the leaders sign treaties, but when the individuals open their hearts. And the sailing to the undying lands, the admission of a dwarf to the blessed realm by grace and by friendship, is Tolkien's final statement on the matter. The ultimate boundary, the last wall, the barrier between mortal dwarf and immortal elf, between the children of all and the blessed land of the Valar, even that wall falls before the power of a friendship that refuses to accept it. If that wall can fall, Tolkien is saying, then any wall can fall. If that boundary can be crossed, then any boundary can be crossed. If the grace of friendship can carry a dwarf to the undying lands, then there is no division between peoples that friendship cannot, in time, overcome. That is the hope that Tolkien built into the ending of Legolas and Gimli's story. It is a quiet hope, a personal hope, a hope that does not depend on grand gestures or sweeping social changes, but on the willingness of individual beings to love each other across the lines that divide them. It is, I think, the most hopeful thing in all of Tolkien's work, more hopeful than the destruction of the ring, more hopeful than the return of the king, more hopeful even than the sailing of Frodo to the healing west. Because the ring's destruction removed an evil, the king's return restored an order, Frodo's sailing healed a wound, but Legolas and Gimli's friendship created something new, a possibility that had never existed before, a proof that the world could be different, a crossing of a boundary that opens the way for every crossing that follows. Part 40. The ship, the sea, and the end of the tale. We have come to the end. The story of what happened to Legolas and Gimli after the ring was destroyed has been told, from the forging of the friendship in the fire of the fellowship, through the long years of peace and building, to the sailing of the grey ship into the west, carrying an elf prince and a dwarf lord into the undying lands and out of the story of Middle-earth forever. And I want to leave you with the image itself, the image that Tolkien gives us in those brief lines of the appendices, the image that contains, in its simplicity, the whole meaning of everything we have explored tonight. A grey ship on the water, an elf at the helm, his face turned toward the west, toward the light he has been yearning for since the gulls cried at Pelargir. And beside him, on the deck, a dwarf, old now, his beard white, his hands stiff, his great axes laid aside for the last time, sitting in the elven ship on the open sea, sailing toward a destination he was never meant to reach, carried there by the grace of a queen he loved and the fidelity of a friend who would not leave him behind. That is the image, a small grey ship, an elf, a dwarf, the sea, the west. And the last members of the Fellowship of the Ring sailing together into the unknown, into the blessed realm, into the place where beauty does not fade and friendship does not end. Because the friendship between them was so strong and so real and so completely beyond the boundaries of what anyone thought possible that it carried them both, at the very end, to a place where the boundaries no longer mattered. Tolkien gives us this image in a few brief sentences, almost in passing, as though it were a footnote rather than a world-changing event. And perhaps that is fitting. The greatest things in Tolkien's world are always quiet. A hobbit finding a ring, a gardener planting a tree, two friends keeping a promise, a dwarf sailing west. The world is changed by the quiet things, the personal things, the things that happen between two beings who care about each other enough to cross every line the world has drawn between them. Legolas and Gimli. The elf and the dwarf, the prince of the forest and the lord of the caves. The archer and the axeman. The friends who should not have been friends, and who changed the world because they were. Thank you for sailing this long road with me tonight. Their story is gentle, and it is beautiful, and it is finished. But the thing it proved, that friendship can cross any boundary, heal any wound, and carry you to the ends of the earth and beyond, that is not finished. That lives on, in every friendship that dares to cross a line, in every heart that opens to the stranger on the other side of the wall, in every moment when two beings who were not supposed to love each other choose, stubbornly and magnificently, to love each other anyway. And if you remember only one thing from all of this, from all these words, from this long exploration of two lives lived after the Great War, let it be this. The most important thing Legolas and Gimli did was not the fighting, or the building, or the ruling, or even the sailing. The most important thing they did was the befriending. The day an elf looked at a dwarf and saw not the enemy, but the friend. The day a dwarf looked at an elf lady and saw not the oppressor, but the beautiful. The day two warriors, standing on the walls of a fortress that was crumbling around them, started counting the enemies they killed. Not because the count mattered, but because the counting was a way of saying to each other, in the only language their pride allowed, I see you, I am with you, we are in this together. Everything else followed from that. The caves, the colony, the rebuilt city, the neighboring realms, the long decades of competition and conversation and mutual enrichment, and the slow, stubborn, world-changing work of proving the ancient enmity wrong. And at the very end, the ship, and the sea, and the crossing into the blessed realm together, carried by grace and by love into the place where no boundary lasts and no friendship ends. That is the whole story. An elf and a dwarf became friends. And because they did, the world was never quite the same. The ship has sailed. The sea is wide, and the friendship that carried them both is as real as ever, as long as the story is told. Until next time, and may you find your own Legolas or your own Gimli on whatever road you walk. The wall between you and the stranger may be old, the history may be long, the differences may be real, but the friendship, when it comes, will be worth every mile of the crossing. Legolas and Gimli proved that, and their proof stands, as solid as dwarvish stone and as enduring as elvish song, forever, the elf, the dwarf, the sea between them and a world of grace beyond it. That is the end, and it is enough.